minor master plan amendment. Then we're turning to Bill 5120, which is the window guards legislation. Then Bill 5020, which is the Mercury Service Regulators legislation. And then finally, an appropriation for small business rental assistance. All right, Glenn, and welcome Councilmember Katz. Glenn.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, just to summarize the last meeting, I just want to make sure I have it correct. The very first item in the packet had to do with operational improvements which are identified as possibilities in the technical appendix for the intersection of Shady Grove Road and 355. These are all improvements which don't involve any widening at all. It's just a matter of changing the lane assignments as well as changing the signal phasing. And Mr. Reamer had, in the little discussion we had, Mr. Reamer had suggested that rather than putting those in the plan explicitly, that they be mentioned in the plan as possibilities that could happen over time as a way of mitigating congestion. And but I didn't recall at the time whether or not the other committee members had weighed in on that suggestion. I think that's a good idea. So for Mr. Friedson and for Mr. Jawanda.
Yeah, is planning comfortable with that? Ms. Sanders, Mr. Anderson?
Sorry, I was just logging in.
So I'll let Dr. Orland repeat. Sorry, thank you.
Hi, sure. Casey, the end of the meeting before we shut off, the transportation appendix in the plan made some suggestions as to ways to mitigate the congestion at Shady Grove Road and 355, which were operational in nature. They didn't involve any widening of the intersection. It was strictly changing lane assignments and changing the signal phasing. What Mr. Reamer had suggested was, rather than putting them in the plan, was to mention them as possibilities that could alleviate congestion and just leave it at that. I mean, explicitly list them, name them, but not say they are, recommended or required elements of the plan. And I was just checking to see if Mr. Friedson and Mr. Jawanda were okay with that.
And I asked whether or not, what your opinion and what the, whether or not there's.
Can you go around one more time? My thought there was that I don't know how often we put operational plans into master plans. I think it's useful to know that operational improvements can address structural issues, which I think is kind of the core of the point here. But
yeah, if I may, when Edgar was here, DOT took a very hardline position that we should not mention any operational aspect of anything having to do with managing the transportation right of way. And I think we've come a long way in the direction of including operational recommendations for exactly the reason that Councilmember Reamer just mentioned, which is that sometimes there is very good reason to conclude that there's operational changes to an intersection, for example, like light timing and things like that, that could address a congestion problem that otherwise would have to require some physical, a widening of the intersection, additional turn lanes, things like that. And so I think in general, it's a good thing that we have kind of gotten away from this rigid separation of, well, planning is all about, you tell us what the right of way is, and then the operational agency takes it from there. I mean, I think as long as some of these specific things are mentioned in the plan, that's the important thing. It doesn't necessarily say that it has to be recommended with a capital R, but I think it is healthy and appropriate to mention them specifically in some way.
I think I might suggest, like we would say, a lot of these issues can be addressed with operational improvements. For example, the planning board considered boom, 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 and then you make that statement. I think the thing is that in 10 years, it could be a different set of operational improvements that would actually move the needle, just because whatever circumstances are in 10 years. So I think
as long as the list isn't considered exhaustive, and as long as it's, for example, as examples to allow for flexibility. But I also think that it's important that the overarching goal, which is to create, a more livable and walkable and attractive and enticing community. I mean, that is the purpose of this master plan, and we would want, the operational changes should be with keeping that in mind. I see Mr. Conklin is.
Yeah, I was going to offer validation to you and Councilmember Reamer. I think having the plan explore operational strategies is a good thing. The plan shouldn't mandate specifically what operational strategies are implemented. So the pipeline is very useful.
Yeah, I'm happy to go along. I think it's a good suggestion, Mr. Chair. It'd be helpful if we had, language that we could see subsequent to this before it goes to full council, and just make sure it reflects the goals here. But I think the spirit of what you're suggesting is a good recommendation. Well, I shouldn't say recommendation because that means something very specific in a master plan, but it's a good idea or thought.
I think the larger point is important, which is what Casey said, that we shouldn't just
pull it off the agenda. We can't walk into a work session and not know where the votes are.
Councilmember Hucker, I think you're not on mute.
Your pardon, sorry.
That's okay. But I agree with your comment there. So we lost my train of thought. The larger point is there are times when operational improvements can make a difference, might be able to prevent a widening. I think that's kind of the general thrust of what we're talking about here. But there's also risk because sometimes operational improvements could work against our other walkability goals. You never really know what they are until you see them.
Yeah, even for instance, as like faster right turns, and that really does put pedestrians at risk significantly. We've tried to avoid that as we move forward. So yeah, I think the approach of theoretically, what are we trying to accomplish here? What are some examples of what has been considered, and allow for flexibility of implementation, recognizing that this is intended to be, a 20 to 30 year plan, not a 2 to 3 year plan, and the operational improvements could be quite different down the road than they are today.
I think there's an important point that operational improvement should be explored, and certain other changes should be a lower priority until operational improvements have been exhausted. I think that's kind of the spirit here, right?
And I was just going to state, this is Carrie Sanders. I think that makes a lot of sense to leave it open because I agree with Mr. Conklin. There might be operational improvements that we don't even know would be available to us in 20 years. So we want to make sure that we keep it flexible enough that the transportation department has some flexibility. I would also state that we could, if the council was amenable, we could pair those operational improvements with safety improvements, such as improved crosswalks or pedestrian signal timing that's more appropriate for the intersection. So if the council members are amenable, we could have those two things happening at the same time.
Agreed.
Sounds good.
That. And, to the point, 20 years from now, there's no question we're not going to have larger scale deployment of automated vehicles, connected vehicles. We have no idea what the transportation issues are going to be in 20 years.
Yeah, we're in a situation, 15, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have assumed that lights could talk to each other. We're going to be in a situation where the lights can talk to the vehicles, and certainly something that none of us have considered yet. So yeah, I think we want to set what the goal is and be solution agnostic, but give some thoughts to what solutions that have been under consideration, just to give a sense. I think that would be appropriate, but we should be focused on what's the goal that we're trying to accomplish in a master plan, and not necessarily dictate what the solution is going to be in 10 or 20 years of how to get there.
Amen. All right. So
hadn't hear from Mr. Juando.
Is he? I'm sorry, he's not on my screen, so I'm not sure that he's here.
Oh, okay.
I believe he's not here yet. He would be on my screen if he was, I believe.
Okay, then we'll move on. By the way, the council's work session is scheduled for Tuesday, and so my packet's due later this afternoon. So what I'll write here in terms of recommendation from the committee is that the committee recommends that operational improvements may resolve some of the congestion issues of this location, and examples are not limited to. Examples are the ones I mentioned in the packet. Something like that. That's what I would write. Okay. Goody Drive interchange. I'll try to make this a little shorter than I did last Monday. The interchange is in the master plan now. It's been there for a number of years. It used to be on the executive and council priority letter because it would be a state project. It's crossing a state road. The plan recommends deleting the interchange from the master plan, and also because there's no staging in the proposed plan, this will no longer be a staged element. In the 2006 plan, there were 3 stages, and one of the requirements for going to stage 2 was the programming of the construction of this interchange within the first 4 years of the CIP or the CTP. The planning board staff actually looked at 6 alternatives to try to meet the congestion standard here, which is 63 seconds per vehicle. That was a standard you confirmed 4 months ago when you approved the growth and investment plan, growth and infrastructure plan, policy. I'll get that straight. And 3 of them were at grade intersections and 3 of them were grade separations. And the only one that actually met the goal was a grade separation where Goody Drive passes over 355. The planning board does not recommend that. They recommend taking it out of the plan, instead doing some minor intersection improvements at Goody and 355, but recognizing that that won't meet the standard of 63. And so they're also recommending loosening the standard to 100 seconds per vehicle. The DOT recommends leaving the interchange in the plan because they point out an event that really happened subsequent to the development of this plan, which was that the state's announced its preferred alternative for the I-270 managed lane project, which would have direct ramps from Goody Drive onto both northbound and southbound 270. And so that'll draw more traffic over to it, both car traffic and potentially bus traffic as well, that would either take bus passengers to a transfer point at that new interchange, or perhaps just get on the managed lanes and continue from there. The city of Rockville is sort of neutral on whether or not there should be an interchange, although they agree there should be a large improvement here. But they also agree that it should no longer be an element of the staging for the master plan. My recommendation is to continue to retain the interchange in the plan, but specify that what we're talking about is the concept, the general concept that's shown on Circle 12 of the packet, which is the Goody Drive overpass. It basically leaves all the movements that exist today at the intersection there, except for east-west travel on Goody Drive itself. What that would do is it meets the standard, so it means there's balance. It reduces delay in the morning peak by 4 minutes southbound in the peak direction. Reduces delay in the northbound direction, the off-peak direction, by ½ a minute. And the same thing's true in southbound in the evening, the off-peak direction, ½ a minute. It does add 3 minutes, a little over 3 minutes, in the northbound direction in the PM. So it's sort of a mixed bag in terms of how it helps 355. It's slightly better, but not a huge amount of better in total. In Goody Drive, though, it removes the major bottleneck for east-west travel in the area. And east-west travel is really important because there's very few places where east-west travel can get to or across 270. And this would be a place where we do that to get to the Great Seneca Science Corridor and the jobs there, as well as to the managed lanes, to the transit and toll lanes there. It would help the BRT marginally, because although BRT has got a single lane, is the current plan, it runs southbound in the morning, northbound in the evening, and won't be affected by congestion because in those lanes because they're the only thing in that lane. But in the off-peak direction, they're running with mixed traffic. So any improvement in the northbound in the morning, southbound in the evening will help the BRT. Now, it helps it very marginally, but it does help it. It reduces pollution at the intersection, as shown in the technical appendix and in the packet, in terms of hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxides. And really most importantly, what it does is, getting back to the point I made earlier, it improves east-west travel in this area where transit is not, there isn't really a good transit option here. The best we can probably do will be just having some more bus service going east-west through here. There's no light rail line, there's no BRT line, nothing of the sort that would take people from Aspen Hill and Eastern Rockville over to 270 and to the Great Seneca Science Corridor. So with those reasons, I am recommending three things. One, including the Goody Drive general concept, overpass concept in the plan, keeping it in there. Secondly, do not loosen the congestion standard that you set 4 months ago. The City of Rockville is also opposed to that, as is DOT. But thirdly, to agree with the Planning Board and the City of Rockville that the interchange should no longer be a staging element in the plan. DOT actually would prefer that it remain a staging element in the plan, at least until we know what's happening and the effect would be of the interchange at Goody and 270. So with that, I'll stop.
Okay. Why don't we take up some of these issues separately. Starting off with the staging element issue. I don't think it should be a staging element. I understood that I think you wrote there, Glenn, that one of the goals of the whole plan is to, not have some of these transportation elements as staging elements. Consistent with that core purpose of the plan, I think it makes sense to not tie it in. And I will say, I'm still, there isn't a very clear answer to me as to what exactly should happen at this intersection. So it doesn't seem right to stage it either. But so first, let's just talk about that. Again, am I right that the kind of core goal of the plan, I could direct this to Carrie or Casey, but the core goal of the plan here was not to have these staging elements?
Yes. I think, I don't want to speak for everybody, including you, but I think the consensus is over the last several years, a lot of these staging requirements, many of our master plans have just proved to be unworkable. And they had their logic and their place at the time, but and I think the same thing was evident in the discussion of the schools moratorium in the GIP. And so I think we want to try to get away from that and recognize that we do need transportation infrastructure, just as we need school infrastructure, but that trying to synchronize growth in a particular neighborhood with big ticket infrastructure projects often just doesn't work out, and it winds up ultimately just stopping the development. It doesn't really accelerate the infrastructure and doesn't produce very satisfactory results, even when it goes according to plan, especially because some of these big infrastructure projects can do violence to some of the other goals like pedestrian safety. You may satisfy some theoretical construct of land use transportation balance, but you wind up killing pedestrians, and that's no good.
I just remembered, I talked to Councilmember Joanna last night, and I know he is presently engaged in an important family activity, and he's going to try to call in at various points when he's available. But he is also going to be potentially only intermittently available. So that's why he's not here.
Short answer is yes. I think everybody I'm aware of on this plan, certainly planning staff, planning board, DOT, and as far as I know, the council staff all agrees that we should not be in the business of staging this.
Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I know you're taking it up individually, but for what it's worth, I agree with Dr. Orland on all of this. I think this makes a lot of sense what he's suggesting. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm broadly in agreement, particularly on the staging, elements. I think there's broad consensus on that, but I see Mr. Conklin has been raising his hand, so I'd like to hear from him if that's okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify how we were viewing staging. We're not necessarily interested in holding up development in the plan for this to be done, but didn't want to endorse removal of the staging without the plan demonstrating a commitment to address the long-standing problems at this location. And that's it for staging. I'll speak to the other elements when it's appropriate, but in my mind, they were linked, that the plan needs to recognize that investment and improvement is needed here. And if the plan does that, I don't think it needs to be staged to that point.
If the plan recognizes that improvement is needed at this location, that makes you more comfortable in not having it be staged.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, let's agree on staging, and then let's move on maybe to the next item. I'm in agreement with you, and I think for the reasons that you stated, and I think that's a core element to this entire plan as it's been proposed to us. I think this is important.
Good. Now let's talk about the standard. So the planning board's recommending that we raise the standard, the allowable congestion standard. Can you talk to us about what other intersections along 355, what's their standard? Is the proposed standard consistent with other similar intersections? Like, how do you, contextualize your recommendation to the planning board?
Well, I'm just following what the council did last fall.
Sorry, I knew where you were coming from. I was
I'm sorry.
You were recommending we retain the existing standard, Glenn.
Gotcha.
I understand. And so I wanted to ask planning, they are recommending that we raise the standard. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, it's closely related to this question of whether it's desirable to put interchanges on 355, but I'll turn to Carrie maybe to elaborate.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Actually, I think it would be helpful. We have a few slides that Jessica McBarry has. If you wouldn't mind, council members, if we just brought that up, because I think that would be helpful to visualize some of the things that we're speaking of. And I will, while she's working on that, I will just state that we actually think with the growth and infrastructure policy direction we received from the council that we have to look at this corridor comprehensively, not just like one intersection at a time, but really how all the intersections function together and affect each other. So often, like with traffic modeling, you'll plug in numbers for a given intersection. That's usually through Synchro, a computer program. That will then look at that intersection in isolation, but not look at how other intersections impact it. So in other words, it might add a turn lane and that would fix that problem at that intersection, but it doesn't really look at how it affects the intersections, let's say north and south. So we used a more sophisticated model for this plan called VISM, which does look at the intersections north and south. And it kind of shows when you make an improvement at one intersection, what that does to the next one. And that's the way that the growth and infrastructure policy is headed. What you've adopted is really looking at the whole corridor at once. So I think it's more of a question of, when we look at the congestion standards for a given intersection, we kind of have to look at it for the whole corridor, not just one. And that's what we attempted to do with this. We're really worried, and you probably received a chair's memo about this last night. We're really worried about, creating other intersection problems north and south on the BRT as a result of making an improvement at this intersection. So if you wouldn't mind, Jessica, going to the next slide, I think this just gives you an overview of the improvement that Dr. Erlin suggested, which we studied as well. We did look at alternative intersection improvements here, and we studied each one, and we went into quite a bit of detail. So that information is, so that council members are aware, all that information is available with the plan. So if anybody ever wanted to do an operational improvement, this information is available to them. There's 4 different options that we studied. But with each of those options, as I said, we just saw the traffic being pushed north and south on 355. And that to us didn't feel like a way that we wanted to have an infrastructure improvement go in to just really create other issues.
Let me ask you a question, Carrie, if I could. So what I understood from Dr. Rowan was that the main objective here was really to allow those from the east to get to the 270 corridor, and that's the only real problem that's going to get solved, and it create, anyway, that's the only problem that would really seem to me, well, I wouldn't say only, I don't want to overstate it, but that's the bigger problem that gets solved here.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Orland that the east-west connections in the county are vital. So things like Montrose Parkway are really important connections. Goody Drive is another. I think the issue with this proposal that we saw is, and actually the next slide kind of goes into that. It actually creates delay for the northbound peak hour in the evening, and that's actually one of the peak times that we thought was problematic, and so I think we feel that whatever is done at this intersection really needs to be something that doesn't create delay on 355. So I understand that the Goody overpass does help that east-west connection, but it does add delay for the northbound, BRT as well as cars.
How does it do that? By creating a...
It doesn't.
So we have a disagreement here, as Glenn is saying.
First, I'm looking at the same chart that was in the transportation appendix that was developed by the planning staff and their consultants. And what it shows is, yes, northbound in the evening, it's more than 3 minutes worse in the general use lanes. Southbound in the morning peak, it's 4 minutes better. In the off-peak direction, northbound in the morning and southbound in the evening, it's a half a minute better. And Goody Drive itself, of course, is much better because there's no delay at all going east-west. So I take issue with the comment that this interchange would actually make things worse on 355. On balance, it makes it better. And where the delay happens in the one time of the day where it is worse, northbound in the PM, it's an area of the Shady Grove plan where the council said that congestion is not an issue. There was no congestion standard in the Shady Grove Metro Station policy area. In fact, you like congestion there because if anything, it helps reduce the amount of cars going through places where, or slows down the cars going through where you want pedestrians to be crossing. So I just disagree with that comment. Actually, it helps 355. But the real help, the main help, is to Goody Drive, and it helps BRT as well. Northbound in the PM, it has its own lane. It doesn't encounter any of that congestion. Same is true with southbound in the morning.
Let's hear what planning has to.
Yeah, no, I think you've acknowledged what I have already said, Dr. Olin, which is that it adds 3 minutes. So I think you're correct that it has other benefits at other times of day. And I think it's, this is a tough question, and I totally respect the decision makers. It's a tough issue. Every time we make an auto improvement that makes it easier for cars to move somewhere, we create problems other places. So it's just like water that, has to run somewhere. So it will run to the other intersections, whether those intersections have a different standard or not. That's just the engineering of it. But I think, in our appendices, we go into the other intersections on 355. And Patrick Reed, I know, is our transportation planner on the call. But it does impact other intersections along 355 in terms of congestion once we make it easier for people to get through this intersection, whether that, no matter what type of these 4 interchange configurations we do, it has impacts. So, I think in the next slide, you can kind of, the overpass in itself, I think also, I wanted to correct something that was stated, I think, later in our memo last night that we sent. Dr. Olin is correct that the Managed Lanes project is proposing a interchange at Goody Drive. But the report that's come out of that project for transit has stated that transit would actually use 370 and not Goody Drive. So I don't think that we're eager. I think from a perspective of planning for this plan, we really felt that making improvements to Goody Drive for transit wasn't necessarily something that we should be doing for managed lanes. If managed lanes indeed is using 370 as its transit route, we weren't.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, but one of the issues that I worked on and it helped advance was this idea that managed lanes projects should have dedicated entrances and exits for transit, so that we could have longer distance BRT that would be really effective, through that project. Are you saying that Goody Drive is not expected to be a location where there will be a dedicated entrance or exit for the potential transit service that would use the managed lanes project?
The cars will be able to, the most recent iteration of that managed lanes project shows that there is an interchange at Goody, but I believe that the transit report that we noted, that we've read through for this project, wants transit to travel on 370 to get to the Shady Grove station, not Goody Drive. So
to get to Shady Grove station, but not to get to Virginia or to get to Bethesda.
Yeah, for travelers that are coming from Shady Grove on transit, they would get on 370 and then get on 270, not go through Goody Drive.
Yeah, the problem is that that study was done, and this is no fault of anyone. The study was done last spring, and of course the plan was in development then, and the plan was reviewed by the planning board over the summer and the fall. And so, based on that knowledge of that study, they drew the conclusion that there may not be an interchange at that location, and there might not be a transit connection. That's clearly no longer the case. And so, in fact, all of the forecasts that are done for the intersection, again, no one's fault, unfortunately, is not up to date because it didn't take into account that interchange. And so the traffic that will be using Goody Drive undoubtedly will be higher to some degree. We don't know how much as a result of that connection to 270. And that study from last summer was looking ahead to try to figure out where transit might go. These are operational decisions. I mean, if Ride-On decided, the DOT decided to run a bus route along Goody Drive to pick up people in East Rockville and Aspen Hill to bring them over to Great Seneca Science Corridor or to get on 270 or transfer 270, they can do that. And so it does have the option of doing that. It doesn't preclude transit being able to take advantage of that. So, anyway,
okay, so Glenn, what you're recommending is right where we're looking at the screen right now, there would be an overpass.
An overpass on Goody Drive going, there you go. Thank you. Thanks, Jessica. If you look on the right, that north-south thing on the right is the CSX and Metro tracks, and that's Goody Drive coming in from the east. And what's in pink is basically two lanes, one lane in each direction, that would continue at its high level, because it's already high up, crossing the railroad tracks. It would stay at a high level, go a little higher, go over 355, and then come back down on the other side. Come back down on the west side.
Wouldn't it have to go up like 20, 30 feet in order to?
No, it's already up. It's already elevated. If you recall, if you go through there today, if you're going westbound, coming from Crabs Branch Way in the industrial area, you're going uphill and you're crawling on a bridge over the tracks.
So you're saying,
and then you're coming back down to the intersection. Instead of going down, well, actually most of the road would still go down because people wanting to turn onto 355 would have to go down to the existing intersection. But those that want to continue over to Goody Drive heading west would stay up in the air. It probably would still be in a continued rise to some degree, but a short distance. So it would clear 355 with an adequate vertical clearance and then come down on the other side. That's why you see that the length of the pink west of 355 is longer than the length of the pink east 355 because it's going to take longer to come down to grade on the west side, but it'll still be short of the entrance to Comcast, short of the entrance to MCPS facility over there.
Right,
the impacts are very minor here.
So I wanted to talk about the congestion standards. I kind of appreciated Carrie's point that we ought to be looking at the corridor generally for congestion strategy here.
And we are. That's what we did. Again, congestion on 355 is better in the morning southbound, in the morning northbound, in the evening southbound. It's worse in the evening northbound, although not as much worse in the evening northbound as it is better in the morning southbound. And then Goody Drive itself is much better.
Well, without a staging requirement, I'm not even sure to what extent this feels very academic to me.
I would suggest, as someone who oversees a lot of development applications in this area in the county, that getting overly specific on this is probably counterproductive. I definitely see Dr. Owen's point. I have a lot of respect for him as a transportation professional. I feel like we've thought over this, and I know Patrick Reed on the call has put a lot of work into this too. And I feel pretty comfortable with the recommendation that we landed with. But Patrick, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on this topic. I see you're on the call.
Hi, Patrick Reed, transportation planner with Mid-County. I just wanted to clarify a couple things about this concept of transit benefiting from an interchange at I-270 and Goody, and thereby that's impacted the needs at 355 and Goody Drive. Our partners over at MCDOT, I know there's a couple folks on the call, were participating in that work group that did the coordinated transit service report for the managed lanes. And I wanted to clarify that there is a section on that report that shows all the potential access points that were envisioned at the plant at the time that report was developed, and Goody Drive is included there. And still, the report suggests that in order to meet the Metro Rail station from points north and south, the best route of travel for transit is I-370. And so I think it's just important to clarify that. The other thing I'd point out here is that subsequent to that report, the MTA partnered with DRPT in Virginia to do a study about transit's use of the managed lanes. And they actually skip over Rockville and show I-370 as a point that, transit would be used for commuter bus purposes to reach the Shady Grove Metro Rail station on the east side of the station. I just wanted to make sure that was clear for everybody. At least as far as we know right now, and there are a lot of moving parts on the managed lanes project, but as far as we know right now, the priority for transit reaching the station at Shady Grove would be I-370, not Goody Drive.
Okay, again, I have not been talking about reaching the station at Shady Grove. I've been talking about getting onto the managed lanes network to go to points south, or coming from points south and coming out here. I don't really have a view on these other things. I'd like to hear from Director Conklin.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple points. The managed lane study transit studies the state has completed have been in no way endorsed, nor the recommendations endorsed by the county. There's obviously a lot of independent thought on how transit would serve this area, so I don't want to get too hung up on what that project's recommendations are. We're not, there's still uncertainty about whether that project will advance beyond planning and engineering stages anyway. So there's so much uncertainty about where a bus would go in the future that I don't really think it's a worthwhile endeavor to focus on that here.
Okay.
What's known here is that Goody Drive has been mentioned, is one of the few east-west access corridors in the county. It's a very important transportation route, not dissimilar from 355. This is a situation where we have two major highway corridors, road corridors intersecting. That isn't really all that common in the county. Again, I tend to agree with Dr. Orlin on most of the points here, except that I stopped short of getting hung up in a very specific recommendation and outcomes for what the interchange would look like, or that there isn't with more study a surface solution that, while it may not reach a 63-second performance standard, it could dramatically improve performance here. So our real interest in this is making sure that this plan recognizes and acknowledges that there's a very significant need for transportation improvement at this location. And much like we talked about with the operational improvements, I recognize this isn't an operational improvement, but what this plan has demonstrated is that there is a viable solution for an interchange. Whether or not in the planning and engineering of a major capital project, what you see is what would result remains to be seen. And there are lots of trade-offs and considerations to be balanced here, whether or not a larger surface intersection could possibly be more hostile to pedestrian and bike travel than having an interchange that's located fully within the median of a major road, as shown here. The BRT plan is reflected here. Part of the reason for its configuration is due to the congestion at this intersection. So if an exploration of an interchange here shows that those traffic conditions are different, there would be a response in the engineering for that BRT configuration.
Okay. I think I'm heading.
Kind of my view here, Hans. I hope that's helpful.
No, it's very helpful, actually. Thank you. I think I'm heading. I now see if we maintain a 63-second standard, the only solution is an interchange. But if we do loosen the standard, I think we're setting the stage for a potential solution, like you said, that could be more at the surface. At the same time, we're not ruling out an interchange if for some reason that is some kind of design that actually, I'm skeptical of a flyover of 355, I have to say. I feel like that would have a huge impact on just the whole experience in that area. But I am also very sympathetic to those who live east and want to get west. And, you know, anyway, that's a lot of people. And I am in this location a lot, and I experienced, you know, I was there 2 days ago to pick up a Chromebook for school. So what I want to happen is what Director Conklin just said, which is creative thinking about a surface solution that solves a lot of the problem and doesn't create a monstrosity, you know, on 355. That's the best outcome. But let's hear what colleagues say. So Councilmember Katz has been waiting patiently, and then Councilmember Joando.
Well, there again, I'm in agreement with Dr. Orland. I don't believe that a flyover in this area would be detrimental. I believe that this is the opportunity in a master plan to keep that viable.
Thank you, Councilmember Joando.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation. Director Conklin, as you always do very eloquently, you say something that sounds like we all want to agree with, but I think I want to understand just directly, and other people can jump in on this question, to accomplish what you said would be ideal. What is your position on this issue of the language we need to include to allow what you said, but that could, you know, also not disallow, which is the way I read the planning language, the need for a potential interchange of any type. So hopefully I was somewhat clear. I mean, just kind of where do you fall on that, and maybe others can jump in on the language.
Yeah, thank you. If I were to model language here, I would say something like an interchange has been shown to address the congestion standard here. There are many unanswered questions about the interchange, including its impact on surrounding properties, the physical viability of tying in to an adjacent bridge structure and landing before interrupting access to other property, and its impact on the pedestrian, bicycle, and transit environment. So the plan could say that an interchange is a solution that has been identified and recommend that be studied further. And that it is possible that that's the answer, but not count out the possibility of that great solution either being necessary because this is physically not possible due to utility conflicts and a whole host of other things that I know don't get assessed in a planning level like this, or it's financially prohibitive, or turns out that it's not the best balance of needs here. But yeah, been identified for a long time, and it's one of the most congested locations in the county.
Absolutely.
And I don't think the plan should say that it isn't in the range of possibilities for this location.
All right. So Glenn, Dr. Orland, not exactly what you suggested, but is that something you could craft in such a way that we could take that view?
I can, but can I respond to 20 seconds on this? This actually was studied by the consultant to the planning board. They looked at these different options. In terms of impacts, 3 strip takes, no full takes, 1 driveway. Compared to the other in the northbound grade separation for 355, which would have 5 full takes, 6 strip takes, and 11 driveways. Big difference. $27 million cost is for a state project, is very small. The Brookville bypass, which we think of as being a small project, is $44 million. In terms of utilities, we're talking about a flyover. I'm hard pressed to see what major utilities actually would be impacted. Maybe some overhead wires, but we're not doing any digging in the ground here. So I would think that the planning staff and their consultant actually did a really good job looking at alternatives here. It's not a detailed design, of course, but it is. I think it's far enough along so this is definitely superior and doable. But if you want me to draft the language you just suggested, of course I will.
Well, I don't think, and just to be clear, what was Director Conklin said wouldn't forestall that potential option, right? It would just say it's among others. That's how I heard it. Do you disagree with that, or?
I think that's what he said.
Okay.
I guess.
So I mean, that would be my suggestion. You know, kind of where I am. I'm sensitive to what the chair said about the east-west travel. You know, I'm there a lot as well, and live in the east and travel west quite often myself, and I'm very familiar with the intersection. But we want to balance, you know, the future. Planning's about the future as well, and we hope that we can build out a better transportation infrastructure. We're all trying to do that, and make sure it's safe for pedestrians and bicyclists as well. So I'd be comfortable with that if we could, you know, draft it in that way. I wouldn't want to exclude it completely from an option.
As I said, I'm going to be drafting it this afternoon, so hopefully it'll pass muster. And if they have problems with it, we can talk about it over the weekend and come back with different language.
Okay.
Also, don't forget, folks, you need to settle on the issue about the congestion standard. Again, it's 63 now. That's what you said back 4 months ago. The board is recommending 100. Mr. Reamer suggested maybe going with some number higher than 63. And again, City of Rockville does not, nor does DOT, frankly, in their comments.
And on that point, just before I was going to ask that question, I know Chair suggested maybe going higher. What is your view on that, Director Conklin, as far as the congestion standard and how it interplays with the conversation we just had?
Well, I would note that this intersection is nowhere near meeting that standard, and it's very difficult. It's a very different exercise to develop a transportation improvement than it is to set a performance standard in a master plan. So, you know, 63 seconds is a level of service E performance, which is not particularly good. So this is not like it's looking for free flow traffic in this situation.
So you recommend keeping it the same? Is that what you're saying?
I would recommend keeping it the same, but recognize that may not be achieved and it may need to be revisited at a later date.
Okay.
If it stays the same, and my concern about keeping it the same is that it sets the bar for what the solution has to achieve, and it means that anything that you do that doesn't get pretty close to that is inadequate. And I suspect there's no way to get there without an interchange. So it essentially, you know, determines the likely outcome of what you design.
It sounds like you can't get there with an interchange either.
No, actually, I think you get below there with an interchange. You can
get there with the interchange. Yeah. Can I make a suggestion there? I think if we said that the improvement must meet the the congestion standard in the infrastructure policy at the time the project comes forward. We don't know when this project's going to come forward. It could be 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and you'll be changing. You'll have opportunities to change the GIP. Every 4 years. It could be that 4, 8, 12 years from now, you're going to have a different standard. Then you may decide that you can go with more congestion in this area, maybe the more consensus on that, in which case then when you get to the point of actually designing this interchange, or this improvement, then maybe it doesn't have to be 63 seconds.
Right.
But so that's gives you a little wiggle room.
Remove the you just say to remove the 63 and just say at the time, and we would have to set it as we get closer.
I wouldn't say it that way. What I would say, the GIP has a standard of 63. What I would say is do an improvement here, which could include an interchange, which would meet the then current congestion standard for this area, for this particular area, the Rockville policy area. And again, and leave it that way. I wouldn't say anything in the plan about what the standard is. Right. That's a GIP option. So.
Got it. Okay.
The last thing I would say though, I'm a little worried about just leaving it open to just possibly an interchange, because we know enough to know that the other kind of interchange actually makes things much worse. The interchange where 355 gets a free pass and Goody Drive intersects with 355. All the information that we got from the planning board shows that causes much worse congestion, costs 3 times as much, has about 3 times the negative impacts. City of Rockville is very, very worried about the negative impacts of the interchange. And so leaving it vague as to what the interchange concept would be, I think, is a mistake. I think if we mention interchange, I think we should mention the Goody Drive overpass.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's helpful. I think I've, said where I am. I want to hear what colleagues think, but thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's hear Councilmember Friedson's view.
Okay. So I think we're talking about two things that are related. I mean, just like staging, is related. I mean, I think it would be helpful for us to separate out the conversations. Then once we decide on one point, then move on to the next point. I think so I'll put aside the 63 seconds versus 100-second congestion standard versus tying it to the growth and infrastructure policy, because I think we have to decide on the first question first. Although I hear what the chair is saying, that at a certain point, if you set it to a standard that can't be reached but for one solution, then you're essentially picking the solution, which is what we just tried to avoid in the prior conversation, to be solution agnostic. But if you set the bar so high that there's only one way really to get there, then you have really kind of undermined the purpose of that. So the other aspect, while I appreciate all of the work that has gone into this and all of the thoughts and the fact that everybody here who is speaking about transportation has forgotten today more than I've ever known about transportation, I find it highly unlikely that a project would be $27 million. I just think that is, there's nothing that I have seen at the state level or in my short tenure here at the county that would suggest that a project of this scope and magnitude would come anywhere close to $27 million. So I don't want to pick a number here of what we think it would be. I'm just saying if there was a infinity number, like a $1 in Price is Right, I'd pick infinity. And it's definitely higher than 27. I'd take the plus of 27 million, not the 27 million. Personally. And so I just think we have to be intellectually honest about that. I came into this and continue to be leaning more towards where the planning board is coming down on this. I don't think that their solution is perfect either, to be honest. And there are certain aspects, including the right turns I mentioned earlier, that give me pause, because that is not a great situation for pedestrians either. I don't think there is a perfect solution that's being represented, but I do think that if we are going to do this, we should move more along the lines of what we already did to be consistent in this plan. And so I think, if we were going to allow for this, we wouldn't necessarily say it has to be the solution, but that it would be exercised after operational improvements, at the very least, since that's what we already just did on the previous item. And we can include a list like, intelligent signalization and other improvements. I'll leave to the transportation experts of what other operational improvements we might want to list, not as an exhaustive list, but as examples if we want to, wanted to include it. I think that, we need to prioritize BRT on 355 here first, that we shouldn't be, putting this project ahead of where BRT is, and see what the impact of 355 BRT might be for this intersection. And then, thirdly, I think we need to make sure and specifically put in a recommendation here that it be consistent with our broader policy goals, including Vision Zero, because to have a solution here that is, totally inconsistent with Vision Zero would make me uncomfortable. Now, if we did those three things, I'd be okay keeping it in and tying the congestion standard to the growth and infrastructure policy at the time, because it would protect against solutions that are inconsistent with our broader policy goals. So, that's where I would be on this, and hopefully
Bravo.
That kind of brings us together.
I think we have a consensus here. Appreciate that very much. Councilmember Katz.
Very quickly, and I appreciate you letting me join in with this conversation. I do like the language about the current congestion standard. I think that makes sense. It gives flexibility. And I do agree with the city of Rockville. I think, where all of us are saying, look, we go through here quite often. I certainly go through here quite often, but the city of Rockville pretty much goes through here 24/7. So I think that with what is being suggested could be workable. Thank you.
Okay. So just to, pulling Councilmember Tawanda, Councilmember Friedson's comments here, which very much, I think we're all pointing in the same direction. So there's an important point there about prioritization, that, smart signaling and other kinds of improvements should be the first priority. We agree on removing the interchange from staging. I'm comfortable with the congestion standard being set through the growth and infrastructure policy, and saying that there should be an improvement, not calling for a particular interchange or any kind of design. However, it's not, it could be looked at alongside all the other options that are looked at in the future.
If I may, we actually, through this discussion, came up with some language, if that's all right, if we would be able to share it with you to get your feedback, because I think it does reflect some of the items that the committee members just discussed. We had some other background slides. I did want to just let the council members know that the city of Rockville does have some mixed use areas right near this intersection. Obviously, that's not part of our planned zoning, but it is their zoning. And Jessica McBarry is showing a project under construction, and this is a project that's approved that you're probably all familiar with. Yeah.
Drove by yesterday or 2 days ago.
Yeah. So
nice.
It is. Yeah. So the city of Rockville does have development that will likely, increase those walking trips and other types of trips that really make Vision Zero so essential to council member Friedson's point. So we do believe that, installing all those Vision Zero improvements, making the area more comfortable for walking and biking is going to be really important, particularly folks that want to get to the future BRT stop on 355 and Goody. So I think the language that we've come up with hopefully reflects that other improvements that the council's prioritized through Vision Zero would be installed first before going to the auto improvements. Which it's at some points we totally understand that we need to have mobility, but we also understand that we have a lot of pedestrians crossing here, and we have prioritized saving lives through Vision Zero. So hopefully this language can resonate a little bit here. It's the third bullet, and happy to get your feedback on it.
I think that looks good. I think if we just add the congestion standard, tied to the growth and infrastructure policy, I think that would reflect what I was suggesting very, very closely, actually.
I think that could work.
The only caveat, I'm sorry to interrupt, that I would make is interchange may actually be one of the measures that improves multimodal mobility. I don't know that you would construct everything else, then rip everything else out, and then build the interchange progression that this took.
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't we take this as a very advanced draft, and then we can follow up here and get a little feedback from DOT and then
and our staff.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I mean, how I'm reading this, Director Conklin, is it's the construction should not be prioritized. Not that it cannot be constructed without the construction. So if they happen alongside one another, that would be consistent with not prioritizing the construction, over it. So I think it's consistent with what you're suggesting, at least in the way that I read it.
I think there's a couple language tweaks, but it's a good template.
And Carrie, next time you have the answer already figured out, you're welcome to jump to that slide.
Carrie knew what I was going to suggest before I even suggested it, which I should have known better.
Carrie, would you mind emailing that language around to Chris and myself and yourself, of course, and yes. We'll try to work this out this afternoon if we can.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Thanks.
All right, good. Keep going.
Okay, the next item is non-auto drive remote share. The current plan from 2006 says that we should reach 35% of people arriving, residents in Shady Grove, going to work by transit, and 25% for residents elsewhere in the sector plan going to work by transit, and for 12.5% by transit for employees working in the area. The plan calls for changing that to say that the residents, the NIDMS for residents in the metro station policy area portion of the sector plan, the area around the metro neighborhoods, should be 50%. And this is not just for transit. This is transit, walking, biking, ride sharing, even telecommuting. So that's one of the reasons why it's so much higher than 35%. And they go on to say 35% for residents living within the sector plan area, but not within the MSPA, so living in Durwood or this area near Goody Drive. And then 15% for employees commuting into the area, into the sector plan from elsewhere. DOT supports increasing the NIDMS. They believe the plan needs to either make additional recommendations for programs. The Rockland mayor and council also support higher NIDMS, but they don't want them to be unrealistic. My recommendations are, first of all, to agree with the board on the NIDMS for residents living in the metro station policy area, that raised to 50% for some of the reasons I just mentioned. However, the journey to work goal shouldn't just be for people who are coming from outside. It should be from anybody coming to work in the metro station policy area, including people who live in the metro station policy area. So that results, I think we'd have a higher load share there goal than the 12.5% that the board is recommending, or actually 15%, higher than 50, we go to 20%. And then in terms of the rest of the area, you set NADMS already for Durwood back last fall as part of the GIP at 39% for residents and employees taken together. And I'm recommending staying with that. So those are my recommendations for NADMS. It's a tiny bit more, I don't even know if it's really more aggressive than what the board recommends, but it puts it in terms which are consistent with other areas in terms of how it's measured. It's all journey to work. You're talking about all employees, all residents, not those living in some areas versus another.
Okay. Whoa. Councilmember Friedson sent me something and wants to know if we can share it. Do you still want to do that? Is that actually Redland Road? I had seen that already.
That's Redland and Crabs Branch, Mr. Chair. I just thought it would be helpful for the purposes of the discussion to discuss what we're talking about when we say target speeds.
I had actually seen that. I'm embarrassed to say, probably on TikTok already. It's a video of a pedestrian almost getting killed. Has everyone seen that already? How do we? I don't know if I know how to.
It's for target speeds.
Okay.
The next item, if we want to share.
All right. So, okay, council staff's recommendation. Any comments from planning on the current segment? Sounds good. All right.
So
Yeah, I don't believe we have any issue with this recommendation.
All right, great. Without objection.
Okay, target speeds on page 7. Target speeds are speeds that are set in master plans, and the goal is to get the prevailing traffic to travel at that speed through whatever means necessary, through design, through operational improvements, enforcement, etc. The plan recommends, the law recommends, says that within metro station policy areas, the target should be 25 miles per hour, unless the council, in adopting a master plan or CIP project, decides something different in that particular location. In this case, the planning board's recommending effectively the default value that's in the law, 25 miles per hour. And I think that's totally appropriate. You're talking about an area which is going to have a lot more development, a lot more walking and biking in the metro station policy itself. Where I'm raising the issue is really outside the metro station policy area, where there isn't any land use changes proposed in this plan. There's no density. There's no land use changes really at all. Outside of 370 going north, outside of Redland Road, north of Needwood Road, south on Crabs Branch, and 355 south of Indianola, where the context has not changed. Walkability and bikeability, the number of people walking and biking are not going to change very much over time because the land use isn't changing. I totally agree with the proposals from the planning board to improve Vision Zero improvements both within and without the metro station policy area in this area. And by the way, Mr. Friedson, the Crabs Branch Redland Road intersection is within the metro station policy area, so there would be a 25 mile per hour target speed both on Redland and in Crabs Branch.
Yeah, I think I misspoke. I think what I sent to the chair was Redland and Needwood.
Redland, Needwood. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure. Okay. Just beyond that is where we're talking about going beyond. Well, you're right. It's outside the metro station policy area, so I guess it would apply there. There actually was a fatality, by the way, at Crabs Branch and in Redland Road several years ago. A major truck.
That's why I missed. That's what I was thinking of when I.
Yeah. We all remember that one. It was a horrible thing that happened there. In fact, that was one of the arguments that DOT made at the time, not the current administration, why we shouldn't have tighter turns at intersections, because the truck couldn't make the turn, ran up on the curb and killed a woman. We're beyond that point now. All I'm saying is that even with all of the improvements that are talked about in the plan and recommended in the plan, I don't believe we'll ever get to 30 miles per hour, which is what the plan is recommending as the goal for these roads outside the area. It's 35 on Crabs Branch, it's 35 and 355 south of Indianola, it's 35 north on Redland, and it's 45 on Shady Grove Road north of 370. The Shady Grove one is particular strange, frankly, to me, because that's a road that has no houses, no businesses abutting it, very few intersections, very few reasons for people to cross the street there, frankly. And it's really no different in design than Mid-County Highway, which the plan recommends retaining 45 mile per hour target speed. Nevertheless, the plan does recommend some traffic calming, reducing the width of the lanes on that section of Shady Grove, which I support. I'm just saying that even if you do that and all the other things that are said in the plan, you realistically are not going to get down to 30 miles per hour. And I think it's basically a false promise. The only way you get to 30 miles per hour is if you put, in addition to everything the planning board's recommending, speed cameras along that road to say anybody goes over 9 miles over 30 is going to get a ticket. And I think you get a lot of negative pushback from that if that ever happened. So that's why I'm suggesting the target speed remain at 45 there and 35 in the other locations outside the vegetation area. Thank you.
So target speed is not necessarily the speed limit, it's how you design the road, right? It's what kind of environment you want to create. So why wouldn't we want the target speed to be quite low, even if,
No, it's really more than that. It's target speed means you do everything you can to get traffic down to that level. It is engineering changes like narrowing the lanes, bump outs, for example, in commercial areas where there's a lot of pedestrians. But it also means operational improvements.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt.
I'm sorry. It also means operational improvements and enforcement.
In lay terms, it's the speed limit is what the law says you're allowed to drive, and target speed is what an ordinary user under ordinary conditions would do, right? And that's why context matters, right? How often you have an intersection, more urban intersections and urban blocks are shorter than suburban blocks, how close you have buildings and trees and other things, whether it's buffered by a sidewalk, whether the lanes are narrower. The wider a lane, the more you feel like you're supposed to go faster, and so you naturally do go faster. I shared the video because it is directly related to what we're talking about here. That's why I suggested it. You saw a car going at deadly speeds, nearly miss a pedestrian. And I think at a certain point, we got to make decisions of whether or not that's an activity that we want to encourage or discourage, and whether or not we are going to put the policies in place that try to bring vehicle speed down to a level that avoids collisions, and when they happen, makes them less likely to be fatal. And if that person had been hit by that car, that person almost assuredly would be dead, and we'd be talking about another fatality. And I think, to me, this is not it's a philosophical difference, but it's a pretty easy one for me. We've made major commitments on Vision Zero. We talk a lot about, safety being our top transportation priority, and how that has been secondary and needs to be primary in all of the policy and engineering decisions that we make. And I don't think that you can do that and then not have a conversation about target speeds, which is literally at the center of the very question of safety. The only thing that matters when it comes to safety is how fast vehicles are moving, during a collision. That is it. I mean, other than that, the changes that you make are nominal at best. If you can't bring the speed of the collision down, you're not going to make a meaningful difference into the fatality rates of those collisions and the likelihood of those collisions. That is the entire conversation. Said my piece. I shared that because I think it's important that it be part of this conversation to actually put real life examples of what we're talking about and how scary that is, because we're talking about issues of life and death here. And I think that the planning board's recommendations are more reflective of what we have been moving towards more slowly than I think many of us would want, but we've been moving towards over the last many years in terms of road safety for all users. And it's not just for pedestrians and bicyclists. I know the focus here is how many bicyclists, how many pedestrians do we really have? The speed of cars creates collisions for people in cars, driving cars, passengers in cars. It makes those collisions more likely to be fatal. So it's not just about pedestrians, and it's not just about bicyclists, it's about all road users. And if we don't bring target speeds down, we won't reduce the number of collisions, and we won't eliminate deadly collisions, which is our ultimate goal here. And I think this is a master plan. Almost everything we have in here is aspirational. We just spent an hour talking about transportation infrastructure improvements that may or may not ever happen. I mean, we're trying to move towards what we think ought to happen and how we want to design it. And we ought to design it in a way that keeps people alive.
I have a question at some point here. Yeah, thank you. So on the target speeds question, I think, well, first let me say, I don't think there's anyone, I'll speak for myself. I care deeply about Vision Zero and our commitment to it, and that we make our roadways and our transit corridors safe for every mode of transportation, with a particular focus, as it should be, because it hasn't been for a long time, under our equity framework for modes of transportation like pedestrians, like bicyclists, and others who have been ignored in transportation planning for a number of reasons. So totally on board with that commitment. When you get into the details of how decisions are made here on target speeds, the mid-county highways example that Dr. Orland brought up versus another roadway here and why those decisions were made, then you have to get into the details of, okay, what's really happening here and what is projected to happen and what does this really mean for what will happen based on what we set as the target. So I want to go back to that question and, definitely Dr. Orland, Director Conklin, planning, anyone can chime in on this, of when we set a target speed, okay, we want the road to be designed in such a way that, my understanding of it is, we want it to be designed in such a way that it produces traffic slowing to this or comporting with the speed that we're setting as the target. But could you talk about a little bit more? You said enforcement, you said design. It's not setting the speed limit, right? That's a separate thing. But just what does it actually mean, and what are the things that would need to happen if you set it at 25? What needs to happen? What would need to happen? I think we all agree that we should narrow the lanes and do the other improvements that will slow people down. But talk about the rub against setting it unrealistically, or what are the things that would actually need to happen to make that happen? And are they doable? And what would they be?
I could start if that's helpful.
Yeah.
It's really a complex issue. The target speed is the speed we would like to see occur on the road. So it isn't the speed that is going to occur. It isn't going to stop somebody who's reckless and irresponsible from going faster. The speed limit may actually be quite a bit higher than the target speed that's established in the plan. In order to achieve that target speed, you need a holistic set of conditions to materialize such that that is the speed at which all the cues are telling them that's the speed they should be traveling. So a lower target speed is encouraged, or a lower speed performance of somebody driving to get to the target speed we're looking for is encouraged by factors like the width, like the number of signals, like the amount of other activity, like the proximity of buildings, and all of those environmental cues that drive how you, that's probably the wrong word, that influence how quickly you drive. So without a lot of those factors, we can set a lower target speed, but there's really nothing that's going to result in that target speed being achieved. So what we're doing is we're creating a greater delta between our planning objective and the performance of the infrastructure that's out there in the world. Right. If we have long straight roads and people are driving a long distance on them, they're unlikely to slow down until those other cues tell them to slow down. In my view, the most effective way to address this is to have the lowest target speeds in those environments where we have the most multimodal activity, and to step down as we get closer and closer to them from what we would see in a more rural or less densely settled suburban environment. I get concerned about us having too much differential between what we're actually achieving on the road and the target speed, but the target speed is the most academic of these factors.
Sure.
The speed limit and the speed that's actually occurring on the road are what we're actually seeing. The target speed is what we would like to see. And when this all started, the whole target speed idea started, it was because there used to be a practice of designing the road so that people felt were safe traveling faster than the speed we wanted them to travel. And the target speed was a tool to say, no, we should be designing the road, and I shouldn't just say the road and its surrounding environment, so that the speed that is occurring is the speed that we want to see. And that's how this all started.
Right. It's fun. I'm glad you said that last point. I remember being in driver's ed, 25 years ago, and I was 15 years old in 9 months in Maryland, and saying to the driver instructor that these suggested speed limits, on turns, for example, or off ramps, always seem to be lower than what you actually could do, but safely. And he said, "Oh yeah, that's the way they're designed." And anyway, so it's an important point. Yeah. I guess so. There's no direct relationship then to if you go from 40 to 30. Here are the things that you'd have to do. There's no manual of there's a menu of options that you ran through, but there's not a one for one. It's more of just what we want to see happen, and then we're going to have to design and try to achieve it as best as possible, realizing we have a certain set of tools.
That's right. And the tools that are on the road itself are only a portion of the tools that need to be employed. So these are really, really important things when you're working in a new environment. They're a little bit less impactful when we're talking about
already a built out road,
a built environment.
Yeah. And I do want to also point out that what you're suggesting, Dr. Orland, if I'm reading it correctly, is to go within the transit corridor. I'm referring to it wronger, but the closer you are in to the denser, more transit-oriented areas, to lower it, but to have kind of a step up as you move outside of those areas. That's correct. Is that a fair characterization? What you suggested?
I think you're muted, Dr. Orland.
Okay, I was hoping it wasn't me.
Oh, the problem is when it's the other way around, when I'm not muted, and I don't know that. Am I on now?
Here,
okay.
Here, you are on.
Okay, so it's again 25 miles per hour is what the planning board's recommending in the metro station policy, or where the activity is going to be. And what I'm recommending is basically keeping the target speed where the speed limits are in the areas outside the metro station policy areas where pedestrian bike activity is really very low. And then, it's and to still do all the Vision Zero improvements that are proposed in the plan to get the really bad speeders down to at least the speed limit level. I should say the planning board's position, particularly the staff's position, I believe the board's too, over time, is to in fact have the speed limits be on this road set at what their target speeds are. Now, they don't make those decisions in the end, but that has been their recommendation. So their goal is there isn't a gap at all between the target speed and the speed limit.
Well, if I could just clarify that,
Please.
I don't believe the plan is trying to be operational in nature, where we're saying, this shall be the speed limit on a street. That's really something that's DOT's call. But I do believe that the plan is what Councilmember Friedson was alluding to. It's really trying to allow designers of the roadway to design to a speed that saves lives. And if we don't have a target speed that is lower, designers will have no ability to do that in terms of guidance or vision. And I think we feel pretty strongly about this part of it because, we've done a lot of legwork, a lot of research through our Vision Zero work on this, and we really do feel that this is an important tool to saving lives. And I will ask if Patrick Reed wants to add anything to what I just stated, because I think Shady Grove Road is a really big issue. That road is in the high injury network. Seen a lot of severe crashes, a lot of deaths. We've actually walked that area not too long ago with SHA staff and MCDOT staff. It's a really big problem. So Patrick, do you want to say anything about this quickly?
Yeah, sure. I think Shady Grove Road in particular was one that council staff called out as being a little bit curious, and I've heard others acknowledge during this conversation that when you have a large gap between segments in terms of speed targets, that there's a problem there. And it is accurate that by statute, our Complete Streets policy requires us to have a 25 mile per hour speed in the MSPA. And so just outside of that, if you recommend a 45 mile per hour target speed for Shady Grove Road, you're essentially creating a 20 mile per hour gap, which is quite a large gap in terms of behavior. So, I think based on the research that we have that suggests that higher speeds can be attained in these more suburban areas, and therefore people are more at risk and are at higher jeopardy. And I think that's shown by the video that you showed earlier, where you are on a more suburban environment. I think we feel very strongly that the target speed should be goalposts. So that way we give our designers flexibility to make the right decisions about how a roadway should be designed.
Yeah. Well, can I just ask on that? I agree with you, what you said, both of you. We want the target speeds to be as low as possible so designers have maximum flexibility. But are you saying that if it's set at 30 or 35 as opposed to 20 or 25, they have less ability to actually design, make design elements that are going to try to slow people down on a road that's already built? Is that the claim? And if so, specifically tell me how. Like what's taken off the table in that context?
It's accurate that the target speed is more of a philosophical element, right? You could still design a roadway with elements that do traffic calming that bring speed below the target speed, or below a potential speed if the target speed is higher. That being said, I think when you approach design, and obviously I think Chris and Andrew are probably the best people to speak to this, but when you approach design, usually your engineers look at the target speed that's set as that guiding factor for how they should intervene in a road. And so, setting the target speed low widens that menu of options generally in terms of your actual practical approach to how the roadway is designed.
And it means that no longer are you talking about traffic engineering concepts like 85th percentile speeds as a target, right? Which is the way that engineers have looked at this in the past, is just to go out on the road and say, how fast are people driving? Let's engineer it to basically match the behavior instead of engineering it to try to change the behavior. And that's why you have things like 15-foot lanes or 14-foot lanes on Old Georgetown Road inside the Beltway, because you have engineers who've said, look, people want to drive fast on this road, so I'm going to design the road to make it safe to drive at that speed. And that was the assumption that drove a lot of the way our roads are designed in the county up until very recently. And I think that's one of the reasons to set a target speed that's not based on what people are doing, but what you would like them to do, which is to drive safely.
Okay.
Right. All right. Yeah, I was just going to say thank you. I mean, I'm all for ambitious goals. I'm fine to set it. It is physical. This is very philosophical. I don't know if there's something in the middle. I'd be fine to set a low target. I want people to design the roads as safely as possible. I don't want to create, and I want every tool to be on the table to do that, to slow folks down. But to the points that Director Conklin made about the gap in between, that's not lost on me either. So all right, I want to think about it a little more, but I want to hear what you have to say, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll turn to Sidney Katz in a moment, Councilmember Katz. I'm pretty emphatically behind planning in general when it comes to some of these really refined, efforts around Vision Zero and just safety. I think they're trying to move the needle to create a different built environment. And target speeds are really important because it frames how future changes. I think Director Conklin is unfortunately correct that, target speeds on a road that's already built probably have less of an impact unless we have an opportunity to narrow the width or, do something. So, with a sense of realism here about what we'll actually accomplish, I think we, broadly speaking, really do want to push in the direction of lower target speeds so that people will have a more calm, approach behind the wheel. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chair. All right. This is an extremely important topic, and it literally is life-saving in many cases. I know of areas where traffic calming, and we've tried a variety of things, the chicanes, to move traffic from one side, or to narrow lanes, to put bulb outs, for pedestrians so it'd be safer. There's all of these ways that it should be done. The whole idea, I can tell you, way back when in Gaithersburg, not to always go back to that, but that's my roots, as it might be noted, that we actually had, when we first put in speed cameras, that we had one area that was getting so many speed tickets from those speed cameras that we looked at it because the way the road was designed was a much faster road. So therefore, we had to look at what we were doing and how we did it. And so I do believe that we do need to have the proper targets. And I also believe, and we were talking about Shady Grove Road before, Shady Grove Road, I mean, I remember Shady Grove Road when there wasn't a traffic signal at 355 and Shady Grove Road. I mean, so I go back a little ways on that. But I can tell you on Shady Grove Road, for many, many years, there was no reason for a pedestrian to cross that street on Shady Grove Road. There was nothing on the other side for a long time. And now, of course, we have many reasons to do it. So things do change, but I do believe that the target speeds are something that we should keep in mind. And what I've always believed is you could have a target speed and you could have a design of the road that's faster than the target speed, but you can't have the design on the road so that if you do go to the target speed, then it makes it unsafe. So we have to be very careful with that as well. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask one more quick question?
Sure.
To Director Conklin and even to Dr. Orland. So then I would just say, what's wrong with having the lower target speed? We're aspirational here. We want to slow people down. This isn't mandating an operational change. Even if planning wants that or not, whoever wants that has to be done through the process that it's done for the speed limit. So what's the problem for saying that, hey, we would like to see this happen and people slow down on these roads and narrowing of all the things that need to happen, and we want to allow maximum flexibility and send the strongest signal. What's wrong with that in the target speed context?
A couple things. One is just a consistency in expectations over the life of a plan like this, where Shady Grove Road is not likely to change all that significantly.
Right.
The spacing of driveways and those things. So the target speed, it may be there on paper, but it's unlikely to be realized. The other thing that I would mention is that the engineering practice around design speed always looks at the values as minimums. So even if you have a lower design or target speed, it doesn't necessarily mean your designer is going to pick the lower speed elements. So there's a disconnect in practice. And if you're setting a speed that a target speed that can't really be achieved through the design of the road itself,
it might render it not even people might just say, well, that's unrealistic. I'm not going to look at it at all.
Or an engineer shouldn't adopt that target speed because it can't be attained through the actions he's taking. Or
right.
she. Engineers can be she's too.
Or days.
Those are the real issues. It's just that if there's too much divergence between what is realized on the roads and our stated objectives, then we lose credibility in the topic.
It just makes it meaningless. Okay. All right. Well, what would planning say to that? I just want to hear that. This is, for me, this is helping me decide what I'm going to do. So I appreciate the indulgence of the chair. Just what do you say to that? It's not realistic. Why are we, it would, kind of renders it meaningless and inconsistent. So what's the response to that?
I actually think that Councilmember Katz hit on that in terms of, what Shady Grove Road is now. 20 years ago or many years ago, it didn't have a location that people wanted to get to on the other side, but now it does. And so I think in this plan, we're trying to be consistent with the county policies of Vision Zero and saving lives. And we want to have a target speed. So I'll just throw out an example. Let's say DOT receives a federal grant to upgrade Shady Grove Road. When they do that, there could be many safety improvements that are put in that lower the speed of the road, but also add crosswalks, or let's say, make nice bus facilities. There could be a number of things. And so what we want to make sure is that when we have this in our plan, that road is designed that way for safety for all users. So that's the example I would give. I think it's helpful to talk in examples.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
hopefully that
Okay.
answers
So
your question.
future funding.
Wando, if I could just add one other thing. I mean,
Please.
we are also suggesting that they be lowered
Yeah.
from
Right.
what the current speed limits are. It's a little different than council staff's recommendation.
Yeah,
Okay.
Nick, can I just say two things? First of all, there's Shady Grove Road and there's Shady Grove Road. The section I think Mr. Cass was talking about is Shady Grove Road within the Metro Station policy area. And again, there's no disagreement. 25 miles per hour is the right target speed for that. But there's also Shady Grove Road north of I-370, which is a very different road. There aren't things to walk to across the street for any way to change, and nothing's changing in the land use. But to try to draw this to a conclusion, and I'll just throw this out a suggestion, it refers to something Mr. Conklin just said. In DOT's comments, they suggested that the target speeds outside the Metro Station policy area might be better set at 35 miles an hour rather than 30. And 35 is actually the current speed limit on Crabs Branch and on Redland, and 355 in those areas outside the Metro Station policy area. It would mean reducing the target speed on Shady Grove Road, or from 45 to 35, which is a big change, but it gets to some of the step down that Patrick was talking about. So it's not my recommendation, but I'm trying to give you an option. Because what we need you to do is to specify what those target speeds are for these roads, because the plan is specific about what roads get what target speeds.
Yeah, and I'd be in favor of that DOT step down, not your recommendation, but that inside the metro policy areas, 25, and then the DOT for the others. So I can be recorded in favor of those.
Okay, I saw Jessica, you had a hand up for a moment. Would you?
Yeah.
No.
Thank you. Council members, one point that I did want to just sort of raise here is thinking about the data behind severe injuries and fatalities in our urban areas versus our suburban areas. And the data indicates that the rate of severe injuries and fatalities is greater in our suburban areas, in these places that we're talking about, where you can achieve higher speeds. And unfortunately, changing the land use context in those suburban locations is going to be more challenging to achieve by 2030, the horizon for our goals. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that we need to sort of use all the tools in our kit, particularly in the locations that are experiencing the higher rates of severe injuries and fatalities. And those tools in the kit include the target speeds and the recommendations that we've put forward in the planning board draft.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, I understand. I think we're trying to get to the same place. The question is, like, what's the I want the big $multi-billion, trillion-dollar infrastructure plan that allows us to put sidewalks on Norwood Road, where every day I watch dozens of football players and students walking and almost getting hit while people fly by, right? And it pisses me off, and I get very upset about it every day. And I slow down to the point that I get honked at. But if we lowered the speed limit to 25 on that road, absent building sidewalks, I don't know if you're, improving the situation unless there's, if we lowered the target speed rather. And obviously there would have to be we'd have to do some actual things to that road to make it safer, is my point. And so I'm fine setting the low target. I don't want it to be a substitute for actually doing the things we need to do to make people slow down. So that's the rub for me, is the realistic view. So, but go ahead. I've dominated here. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, is that okay?
Please.
So I appreciate the interest in compromising. I'm not, I think the chair kind of mentioned this earlier about, being pretty emphatic about the planning's, not only the recommendation here, but the broader move that planning is trying to push the county, frankly, to actually put into policy what we've been talking about when it comes to Vision Zero. This is it. I mean, we've spent most of this conversation talking about what people do, what cars do, what drivers do, how many pedestrians are on the street and where they are. That is not what Vision Zero is. I just want to dispel the notion that Vision Zero specifically talks about the responsibility for road safety not being on road users. and being on policymakers, which is us, and road designers. So the idea that we would say because the drivers do something or they're not likely to respond, that we are going to react in a certain way is literally anathema to what Vision Zero is and what we've committed to. It just is. So, I mean, I appreciate that everybody here wants to keep everybody safe. I appreciate the fact that we all, more or less want to head in a similar direction. The question is how to get there. But there's a philosophical question of how these decisions get made that Vision Zero is rooted in. And that is literally the base of this conversation. I think the point that Jessica just made is critical. The area that we're talking about here is one of the most dangerous areas in the entire county. Number of collisions, number of fatalities, and it is true of similar places all around the county. The idea that we are only focusing on areas with the highest intensity of transit is actually opposite of most of the problems, because the congestion standards there are lower because we have contextual dynamics that require cars to go slower. And so the likelihood that there are collisions are low, and the likelihood that those collisions end up in fatalities. Where most fatalities happen are where there are incredibly high rates of speed, which is almost never right at a metro station, because metro stations tend to be in areas that are more urban from a contextual standpoint. They make people feel like they're more urban. So I also want to dispel the notion that has been discussed here about billions and trillions of dollars of infrastructure. Yes, we need billions and trillions of dollars of infrastructure to remake roadways that are almost exclusively designed for speed of cars and not for the type of context that people live in our community today. And that's a huge challenge that we face. And going intersection by intersection, it would take us 100 years to do it, like it took 100 years to build it in a way that we don't necessarily want right now. But major changes can happen much easier. Old Georgetown Road, there's a road diet. That road diet happened, and I fought very hard with Delegate Corman on that, and Councilmember Reamer was involved and others as well. We had to wait till a death took place. A 17-year-old boy who was riding on his bicycle swerved out of the way for a collision, Jake Castle, and was dumped into the street based on the way in which it's designed, and was killed. And everybody who was involved in that, both Jake and the driver, were doing exactly as it was designed to do. So what did we do? We pushed, we fought, and there was a change. That change was made as part of a resurfacing project. Zero additional dollars were appropriated in order to make that happen. It was literally a bucket of paint. Is it perfect? No. We prefer bollards to be up and to have separated bike lane to make it safer. But it was done within months, not within decades. And it was done with a bucket of paint, not with hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure changes. The planning department, there was a problem on Little Falls Parkway with a collision, and they did a road diet just by putting up plastic bollards in a very inexpensive change on that intersection, and it has dramatically reduced vehicle speeds and has dramatically improved the safety of the dual lane threat that is so often one of the major contributing factors to major collisions and fatalities on roadways. So we have to set the policy. We have to set what we expect, and I can't tell you how many times we are pushing for traffic control devices and other safety measures that aren't hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure, and they don't happen because it's not in context with the type of roadway that it is supposed to be. And right now, we're making the decision of what type of roadway it is supposed to be and what are the type of engineering and design and other elements that we want to encourage. And so I just think it is absolutely backwards for us to think about how do we get closer to what dangerous things are happening on the road by users and making them responsible for the changes, as opposed to saying what is the activity that we want, what is the dynamics that we want, and then how do we create a policy that is reflective of that, and then sending the signal clearly to road designers and to traffic engineers to make decisions that reflect the reality that we intend. So this is our chance to do that. It's very clear to me. I'm not interested in a compromise here, and I don't think we should be compromising when it comes to Vision Zero. I think we should be taking responsibility for what our role is here as the policymakers, ultimately determining what the road engineers and road designers are going to do. And that doesn't just mean new infrastructure. It means traffic control changes that will or won't be made based on how the roadways are intended to be from a policy standpoint.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. I don't appreciate the kind of suggestion that what I heard there is that there's some sort of, it's either trillions of infrastructure or nothing else. I don't think I've said that. I think it's one of many things that we'd like to see happen. And appreciate you're not interested in compromise, Ms. Friesen. I'm just interested in not setting expectations that aren't going to happen. What I heard from Director Conklin, that transportation planners, the question I asked them was like, well, what's wrong with having a really strong, good goal of 25 on these? Because I think having strong, good goals is what we should do. And what I heard back in part was that it might just be ignored because it's not realistic. Now, maybe that's not what he said, but that's kind of what I heard in paraphrasing. And so let's do it. And then when I asked the planning staff, well, what can you not do at 30 that you can't do at 25? And the answer was you can do all the same things. So I just, let's just dispel the notion that someone's better on wanting to slow people down. Let's send a strong message, but let's also be based in reality of how this is going to be operationalized. And so if we can operationalize 25, let's set the strong goal. I'm fine with that. But I think it's worth having the conversation. And we're not setting a speed limit here. We're setting a goal, a target speed. And so I'm fine. I say all that to say I'm fine going with 25, but I think it's important to talk about these things, because of the way it is or is not going to happen or not be, or just kind of be disregarded. So,
all right.
Again, I can be clear. I think no one's disagreeing with 25 as being the target speed within the metro station policy area. Not at all. In fact, Mr. Friesen made the comment about fatalities. The only fatalities in this area, in the area that was measured by planning staff between early January of 2015 to mid 2019, there were 3 of them in the area. They're all within the metro station policy area. 2 on Shady Grove Road near Crabs Branch, and 1 at the intersection of Redland and Crabs Branch, or Indian and Crabs Branch, Redland and Crabs Branch, none outside the area. But 25, everyone seems to agree. The question really is, what do you want to set outside the policy area? Is it the current speed limits, which is what I'm recommending? Was it 30 miles per hour, which the planning board's recommending? Is it something in between? Again, DOT had said in their comments 35 miles per hour maybe makes more sense for those areas outside the metro station policy areas. But you just need to make a decision as to what you want to do.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we make a decision?
Thank you.
I thought I heard.
I support the planning board's recommendation. I haven't heard any way in which I think there was an oversight or, an omission. And at times that comes out in this conversation. Oh, yeah, we didn't quite mean it that way. Good catch. I'm not hearing that in this situation. It sounds to me like the planning board's recommendation was quite fully intentional and they're standing by it. But if there was an oversight, or if this was something where, oh yeah, we didn't really want it to apply in that way, then I would, by all means say, let's adjust. Am I right about where you're at, Carrie or Casey or Jessica?
Yeah, yes, we stand by what we said.
All right, let's keep moving. I think Councilmember Tawanda, was that unanimous, or do you want to be on a 2-1 in favor of the MCDOT recommendation?
I'm fine going with the strong goal. I mean, I'm fine with it. I just, let's just.
No, it's an important issue.
Yeah.
It's helpful to talk these things through. Target speed is a nebulous but really important issue. It's not nebulous, but it's a really important issue. And so it's good to,
Yeah, let's set a strong goal. Let's just make it happen in all the ways we need to make it happen.
All right.
Okay, I think the rest will go quickly.
An hour behind my
anticipated. Well, this it was never realistic. Actually, we're losing an hour.
We need an interchange in this conversation.
Mid-County Highway.
There's the number is tomorrow, Mr. Councilmember Ream.
Page 8, the Mid-County Highway. There's language in the plan which is sort of all over the place with regards to Mid-County Highway. It mentions why there's some problems with extending it east of Shady Grove Road, although it doesn't mention any of the reasons why it's in the plan in the first place. It talks about the council's resolution from a couple of years ago about not assuming any land use from the northern extension of Mid-County Highway, which really has nothing to do with this because that's more than 3 miles away. And finally, the last paragraph basically says, well, we're not sure whether or not we should include this or not include this in the plan, so we'll just be silent on it. My recommendation is just take that entire section out. It really doesn't say anything, and what it says is a bit unbalanced. But I would also, though, in the table 2, which is the roadway classification table, it does show Mid-County Highway, the existing road coming from the northwest, ending at Mid-County Highway, but it doesn't show the extension, which is also master planned, from Shady Grove Road over to Redland and then over to the ICC. And it should, because if we're not making a change in the plan, it needs to be in that table. So those are my recommendations on Mid-County Highway.
Okay, can we take those separately? I guess I don't particularly have a problem with the editorial comments. Anything planning wanted to say about why they put that section in there?
This is Carrie Sanders. Apologize, my network crashed and I needed to call back in. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I would like Patrick Reed to speak to this a little bit. Oh, good, thank you. I would like Patrick Reed to speak a little bit on this. We have gotten some feedback from the public about the Mid-County Highway, as well as wanting to make sure that this plan is really such a small part of the county, and I don't think we wanted to tackle something like this, this larger infrastructure project for the whole county within this plan. But I will ask Patrick Reed if he could add to that, please.
Yeah, the rationale for this section was essentially exactly as actually Dr. Orland described it. There's a little bit of ambiguity about how to approach Mid-County Highway right now. As you know, Council Resolution has told us not to model the northern portion or the northern segment, to take a conservative approach for how we did our transportation analysis. We left it out, that southern segment connecting the ICC and Shady Grove Road. The rationale for that is because any improvement is just going to add a capacity enhancement that will make traffic look better. So we thought that the conservative approach made sense here. But yeah, what our general sense is that this is a big roadway and a big decision, right? And a sector plan like this, where our public outreach is really focused on the communities that live in Shady Grove, it just wasn't the appropriate forum to have that kind of discussion. I think in our discussions with MCDOT, we tried to balance thoughts about how we should address this sort of issue in the plan, and so that's why the section is as it is. But I don't believe planning staff would have a problem with removing any reference to Mid-County Highway generally from the plan.
Okay, but there is an important point that you didn't use it, like it's not assumed for any of the development. But I guess because it's not in the boundary anyway, right? Was that Glenn?
The northern piece was not.
Right. It's not in the plan area anyway.
No, it's 3 miles away.
So it doesn't. And then okay. All right. Well, any comment on removing it? I think it's fine to remove it as well. It just seems a little out of place.
Agree.
All right.
Agree. Okay. And in terms of adding that line in table 2, just acknowledging that Mid-County Highway does go east of Shady Grove Road over to Redland in the plan and connecting to the ICC.
What you're saying is there's no, we shouldn't contradict what is in the actual master plan.
Correct.
Okay. We're not adding it in here. We're just simply not contradicting what is in the master plan of highways.
That's right.
All right, fine.
Okay, the next is a small item, but kind of important in this particular area. There's a map on map 51 on page 123, which shows a proposed street B7, that's what it's called, Columbus Avenue Extended, which comes into the Redland Road from the northwest, but it's offset from Yellowstone Drive on the other side. And good street planning practice would have the roads come in directly across from each other. And so basically, Rich, DOT is recommending, and I agree with them, to change the map to show the two roads actually meeting at the same place at Redland. And there's also two other public rights-of-way, which are between Columbus Avenue Extended and the access road, which are not very well spaced within that superblock, and DOT is recommending that they be more evenly spaced to allow for the same kind of blocks. And I agree with that as well.
Any concerns about that? Planning, good? Okay, thanks.
Next is parking at Metro. This is actually DOT's strongest concern in their letter, was to make sure that a parking possibility at the Shady Grove Station was not reduced and potentially had a chance to grow. The plan doesn't recommend reducing parking. What it says is, for development purposes, there may be an opportunity to reduce the amount of parking on the west side of the station, but assuming that there would be ability to add parking commensurately on the east side.
That's like the surface lot is on the west side, basically, right?
Yeah, it's on the west side. And so I'm just recommending adding some language. It's the bullet on page 9. The current language says this is what the plan already says: permit additional long-term metro parking on the east side of the station, which creates more flexibility for redevelopment opportunities on the west side of the station. And then this is what I would add. Furthermore, the county, MDOT, and WMATA should explore means to expand the number of long-term spaces at the station as demand warrants. And the point being that, yes, there'll be a lot of opportunities to get to Shady Grove other than driving, but there's wide swaths of the Upper County and Frederick County and places north where there really isn't the opportunity, even with what's in the plan, to arrive by transit. And there needs to be the opportunity, at least, to be able to expand parking here. And this just opens the door for that as demand warrants. If it doesn't warrant, obviously don't do it.
Comments from planning?
The positive thing about parking on the east side is it can all get there by 370 and the access road. Oops, sorry.
Harry, your network is running a little slow. I love it when it takes me back to the Matrix. Harry, you might want to just dial in audio and not use your video.
If you want, we could, unless you can do it right now, we could go to the next one and come back to this.
Why don't we do that? If someone could just text Carrie to try an audio only, that would probably help.
Okay. The next is, and we'll come back to this, the next is the market improvements, the two market improvements here, Mark Commuter Rail. One is to create a station, Mark Station at Shady Grove, directly adjacent to the metro station. That's in the current plan as well. This would confirm that. And the other is to recommend that there be a 25-foot wide dedication on the east side of the tracks for any development that happens along the tracks to be able to make room for a third track ultimately, which would then allow, if the third track were ever built, you could have more flexibility in the way Mark runs. You could have more outbound trains in the morning, inbound trains in the evening, trains at night, trains at weekends. That would not interfere with the freight traffic. That's the biggest concern of CSX. Mayor and Council Rockwell supports the Mark Station there. DOT is a little bit more circumspect. Their station a station there may be competing with Metropolitan Grove, which is really considered to be sort of like the end of the line, not the end of the line, but the catchment station for people coming down from 270. And the Town of Washington Grove's Historic Preservation Commission and town resident Gail Littlefield oppose the idea of dedicating the right-of-way. Both these recommendations, particularly the station, is a little bit of a mixed bag. Certainly a station at Shady Grove would enhance MARC ridership for people living at Shady Grove who want to go to Silver Spring particularly. Other places downtown are more likely to take Metro because it's quicker and cheaper. But nevertheless, be a benefit in that regard. But whenever you add a station like this, a major station, you are also then slowing down the trip for everybody north of there. So people coming from Gaithersburg, Germantown, Boyds, Frederick County, West Virginia, their trip will be 4 minutes longer in the morning and 4 minutes longer in the evening as a result of adding that station. Without a third track, it is very likely that, however, that the Washington Grove station would disappear, because MARC has taken a consistent position for the last 30 years that they don't add a station without taking a station out. Now, if they ever had a third station, a third track as well, that may not be a consideration anymore. So bottom line is I'm recommending agreeing with the plan, keep the MARC station in, keep the dedication requirement in, but before making any steps to really implement any of these, even going to design, there should be a much more exhaustive study as to whether or not either or both are really needed. You have the I-270 corridor forward plan. I don't think that the station is part of the scope of that plan. I hope it would be. Or if not, then postpone any thought of having a station here until that study is done. I mean, a transfer between Metro and commuter rail can already happen at Rockville, where that exists. So it's not like it's a function that doesn't exist. It does. It's just a little bit more circuitous. So that's my recommendation.
So you're agreeing with the recommendation from the planning board in the plan.
Except that both should be scrutinized more before you go to.
Right, you're advising more scrutiny. All right, well, I'm all in on MARC expansion. I know there's a little controversy about a third track here and implications for that. I understand the concerns, but I don't think we want to hedge really on whether we want to do that. If it we gotta go at it.
Sure. And the pure fact is that in Washington Grove, they have the authority there. We don't. They have planning and zoning authority. If they don't want to allow the 25 feet, they won't. Don't know what they'll do. Is there any disagreement from the other council members? Or is that unanimous?
All good.
Okay. Montgomery College Metro Station. This is something the city of Rockville is recommending pretty strongly. And the importance of having something that's next to Montgomery College in Rockville. I'm recommending you could basically explore this option, but as long as it's understood, and say this in the plan, that it's a very low priority. And I don't know if I'd say this in the plan, but the project should not be assumed as given even in the long term. I think it's extremely unlikely this will ever happen. There really isn't space for it.
All right, well, hang on. All right.
The cost is
first of all, it's not. Nothing else in the plan is contingent upon this happening, and so why do we have to?
Yeah. Why is it in the plan?
What's that? It's in the plan.
Why is it in the plan then?
Because it's a really amazing possibility. I mean, it's transformational. I have often wondered. I guess I just have a personal thing here. I have often wondered, as I am in that area, boy, that looks like a perfect location. Yes, there are major issues, major issues that maybe in 15 or 20 years, we'll have solutions for those issues we can't presently contemplate. I don't know. But to me, our ability to add a metro station, one day, I think creates incredible possibilities, and I don't see any value in, talking it down before we even get started. And who knows what could happen. So that's my view. Andrew.
Yeah. So I think that at the very least, we should include in here high quality, reliable transit access, and be somewhat agnostic to what transit access ultimately becomes. I mean, I think transit access, to Montgomery College, whether it be rail or bus rapid transit, we need better access to an educational and economic engine than we currently have. Exactly what that looks like and what that's going to be. I mean, I think, again, we should be solution agnostic, but I think we should set out of what we want. I'm less hell-bent on exactly how we frame it. I mean, I think that is a very aspirational idea, just based on the logistical standards, but the broad-based thought process is what we desperately want, and I think what we need, and that is to have serious, high-quality, reliable transit access to Montgomery College, and I think that is clearly where we need to head, and that should be explicitly stated in the plan. Whether or not we specifically say it should be a metro stop or not, I'll yield to see where colleagues are, but I absolutely don't think we should take out a reference to transit access, and improve transit access, whether or not we pick exactly what kind of transit it ought to be. I'll yield to colleagues a bit on that.
Just to add, the 2013 BRT master plan does call for a station, or at least one station, at Montgomery College for the 355 BRT. So it definitely will be, that service will be there anyway.
Yeah. That issue, I think, is adequately addressed. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with you. I believe that in a master plan that it should be a little bit of a dream, and I think this is more than a little bit of a dream. And it might be a dream many, many years from today, but I don't know why we wouldn't include it. Why wouldn't we? I don't see what we lose by putting it in.
Absolutely. And you never know, you just never know. But there is a lot of running room there in between those two stations. And one day maybe we could create a new node. And, I just think it's worth keeping on the board. So,
Mr. Giwando?
Yeah, Mr. Giwando, your audio is not, I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
As the old commercial used to say. Yeah, I agree with that. I know a ton of students that at Montgomery College up there have had serious issues with transportation. So while it would be expensive, it's a good goal, and we should include it in there.
All right. So we are marking the possibility of a new station on the east side of 355 for the Metro, recognizing that there are huge hurdles to actually doing it, but nevertheless, it's a long-term vision of the future. And it seems to me that that's going to happen one day, one way or the other.
And I would suggest we name it after Dr. Orland. That's what I would suggest.
Whatever. So make sure I get the vote right. So Mr. Reamer and Mr. Giwando recommend keeping this in the plan. Mr. Friedson recommends
you can just make it 3-9.
I think it'll be, yeah.
All right.
No one's objecting, and yeah. I mean, again, we're not talking about transit in the area. This is a very specific issue of should we dream about a station there, a new station on the Red Line.
So much for not setting unrealistic expectations, but a very aspirational goal indeed, and happy to be supportive.
If you don't,
it's a huge issue. I think we all know how big of an issue, as Councilman Giwando was just noting. Access to one of our most important educational job training institutions in the entire county is a major, major problem.
And other jurisdictions in the Metro Compact have gotten more stations, extensions of the lines. We're getting the Purple Line. It's not a Metro, component. So why we should be putting stuff on the board too.
Exactly. I just wanted to note, just so that everybody keeps it in their mind, that this is proposed as the end of the Veers Mill BRT, the terminal station being at Montgomery College to improve those connections.
Right.
Also where the route patterns for the 355 service interchange. So it is envisioned to be a major transit center with or without the metro addition.
Exactly. These are very separate issues. Okay, very good.
Okay, the city of Rockville is recommending a pedestrian grade separation over 355 or over or under. They weren't specific. 355 at King Farm Boulevard. The problem with that, from my perspective, is that that's sort of counter to, first of all, what pedestrians will do. You almost never see pedestrians using an overpass or an underpass unless they're trying to go over or under an interstate highway. Obviously, they have to do that, or a third rail for Metro that have to do that. Or more importantly, if the grades on either side are high enough so that an overpass makes sense. They don't have to climb a bunch of steps to get over and then climb a bunch of steps to go down, or take a long ramp to go up and down. So frankly, I don't think this will be used at all. So I'm recommending not including it in the plan. But I'm also saying if you feel necessary to include it, to encourage grade then just encourage that it be studied.
I'm not a huge fan of these kinds of crossings personally, so I hear what Rockville is putting down, but I'm not personally interested in that.
You're not picking it up.
That's what I meant to say. Thank you.
Yeah. What they're putting down. Okay.
No.
I was just going to say, picking up what they're putting down, buying what they're selling.
Exactly.
I don't think we could buy this, I guess, is if we're going to use the buying what they're selling metaphor. So it would be a really expensive infrastructure that wouldn't necessarily improve.
There's one of these over not far from there, and I don't know how well used it is. Okay, let's keep going. Let's see if we can't close this.
Yeah, close. You had one comment from a couple live in Washington Grove about not connecting Crabs Branch Way and Amity Drive. But the last plan called for it, the new plan calls for it. It provides access to the Amity Drive neighborhood. It'd be a primary residential street, so it's not going to carry a lot of traffic, won't be carrying through traffic, and will have very little impact, if any, on Washington Grove. So I'm concurring with the final draft to not change that.
All right, keep going. I think you're concurring with everything else, right? More or less.
Yeah. There are you got a lot of public hearing testimony about the bike and sidewalk connections from Washington Grove. First of all, along Oakmont Avenue on map 52, it shows it doesn't show sidewalks on both sides, although the plan does talk about continuous sidewalks on both sides. And it's a technical point. I think map 52 should show that. You had some folks in the town who want to also have a bikeway there, but as the staff pointed out in their staff report to the planning board, that's very unlikely. They require major right-of-way dedications from adjacent property owners, which they don't believe will ever happen. And it's also not the best route for the bike trail going north from the Shady Grove area. So that's the first point. Just again, changing the map to show Oakmont Avenue with sidewalks, both sides. The second one has to do with the location of the trail. And in your packet, you see maps showing a shared use trail, hiker-biker trail, connecting this, what we just mentioned earlier, the Amity Crabs Branch connection to and through Washington Grove. There was a lot of objection to it automatically going onto Brown Street, which is a street that dead ends south of Washington Grove. But the folks who testified on this were looking at the public hearing draft, which basically directed that the study look at that. It was pointed out to the planning board that if the staff that the DOT was actually looking at 4 options in the area, one of which is Brown Street, but the plan itself shouldn't predetermine where it goes. And so the planning board made that change. And so in the final draft you see, it just says from that connecting road, Amity Crabs Branch, to the town of Washington Grove, is silent in terms of where it is. And so I think I've talked to a couple of the people who wrote in, and I think they acknowledged that they were basically, unfortunately, easily done looking at the earlier draft of the plan and not up to date with it. Okay. So I'm concurring with the final draft on that too. One last thing, really. There's some bikeway recommendations which are really technical on top of page 12, which planning staff highlighted. This came after the final draft came on. I think they all make sense and they ought to be incorporated in the plan. And And then finally, the fiscal impact analysis. We still haven't gotten the fiscal impact statement yet. We may be getting it today on the entire plan, but OMB shared with us the impact for transportation projects, which is about $638 million, half of which, by the way, is for that Metropolitan Grove metro station. And everything else in the plan is equal to that in terms of cost. But that's just information for you. So no decision to be made on that. And the only other thing that I guess is to come back to Carrie to see if she wanted to weigh in on the parking at metro station language, if she's back. Carrie, are you back?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry about that. All right. What I was planning to say is we had WMATA here at the last session, and they spoke to us about some of their plans. I think what we would like to do, or our preference would be to not add specific language about parking, because we often find through the development review process that is something that we can work out with WMATA and balance. I think getting overly specific may not be helpful for that process. We also have obviously the housing at WMATA bill, which could provide a lot of housing at the site, and I think we want to make sure that happens. I think we want to work with WMATA to maximize that. So I would be
exactly. This would bias the public benefits towards more parking away from other things we might want. So I don't want to already put our thumb on the scale as to what we want out of future development there.
Well, couldn't we just say, I mean, this doesn't contradict that. It just says they should explore means to expand the number of spaces. It doesn't, and as demand warrants, it's not specific at all, except basically not reduce them.
I mean, why wouldn't you do that anyway? Like, why won't you also explore means to expand future parking without setting the expectation, that... Well,
I'm just responding to DOT's comment. If Chris wants to weigh in, if he's okay with the existing language.
Well, frankly, what has been described is our concern. This station is critical to meeting all of the non-motorized mode share goals and development desires south of here: Rockville, Twin Brook, White Flint, Grosvenor, Bethesda, etc. In the planning for a major economic development initiative at White Flint in the previous administration, a component of that transportation strategy was to add a couple thousand parking spaces at Shady Grove so that the number of employees desired there could be accommodated without creating a traffic parking mess in White Flint. So
a couple thousand?
Yes, and this one and Glenmont. For
the White Flint sector plan calls for thousands of more spaces.
It was a White Flint sector plan. It was a particular corporate entity's strategic plan who was looking to locate in that area.
Okay.
So I'm just very concerned about handicapping the ability of this station to meet the needs of the rest of the county for those populations that Glenn talked about that aren't going to be all that well served by our other transit strategies or are coming from very, very long distances. And other redevelopment opportunities at those other stations have contemplated reducing parking there, and that may be a reasonable thing to do, but that parking would likely need to end up at this location. So I recognize the desire to accommodate and make redevelopment around here effective, but the parking that's at this station is a really critical element of our regional transportation strategy.
Well, okay. I mean, I'm still not sold that we want to add thousands of parking spaces to this station. I mean, that in and of itself, if that was really the number, I mean, that's multiple garages, right?
I do want to emphasize that you saw some images we shared with you of a WMATA garage. So it's not the planning staff is at all ignoring the parking needs, but I think we want to balance that with the housing needs, because we know that putting housing by transit is really essential to meeting the county's goals. So it's not that we wouldn't provide parking. We just don't want to be overly specific in a 20-year plan about the number of spaces, or when we don't really know yet what all the other pressures will be.
All right, so without foreclosing anything, but without biasing anything either, I support the planning board's recommendation, but I'll see where my colleagues are.
I support the planning board recommendation too.
I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it.
All right, so we hear you loud and clear, but I'm concerned about the unintended consequences of saying something that I have not until now previously contemplated, which is thousands of more parking spaces in this area. I think that would have been something that the community should have had a chance to discuss as they formed the vision for this plan. I'm not saying it couldn't work. I have no idea, but I don't want to just drop this in here at the last second and then have a big impact.
No, I'm not proposing any specific number in here. Just recognize that before 2000, this parking was nearly full.
Oh, it's heavily used. I'm not, absolutely.
Yeah, well, what the proposal isn't to reduce the parking. That's not, you're just saying, well, what's your issue, Chris? I mean, just.
My issue is just that the parking's not protected in the plan. The parking is exchangeable.
So it could go away if a developer,
The opportunity to have more here could be foreclosed relatively easily, and there is no better place for it than here.
Well, I wasn't talking about reducing the parking. I thought you were talking about adding thousands of spaces.
Oh, no, I'm not proposing any particular addition, just that we recognize the extreme importance of having a significant ability to park at the terminal station here.
Well, could we add a line saying, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I was just saying, could we add something to just note that we envision that this is, we're not reducing parking?
I don't know. I mean,
I would not support that.
Yeah, I didn't have any confusion about this issue until just now. So if that could be a sign of what would happen with some language.
I get the point, and I mean, Councilmember Rwanda, I mean, I don't want to, if there's a disagreement, that's fine, but I think one of the challenges that we have is this one-for-one replacement of parking. I mean, we have we're in our planning, we're obsessed with parking, and I get it because that's where we are right now, but we are like desperately trying to
I get it.
get out of it. And so it's hard to put in a master plan. To me, something that we run into all the time, which is, how do you keep a one-for-one replacement requirement which effectively subsidizes single occupancy vehicles, drives up the cost of housing, drives up the cost of development, and at the same time try to say that our goal is to bring down non-auto driver motor. Now, I understand with this particular site, it's tough because you have people who are driving.
Yeah, you're at the end of the metro.
They're beyond, exactly. And so we do want to encourage that to a certain extent, but we also, with 355 BRT and other things, my hope would be that we provide better access points and a better multimodal transit system, which we currently don't have as well as we would want, which would limit the need.
I mean, exactly. I think we want thousands of new housing units here, and not thousands of new parking spaces. All right, I think we're good.
Well, hold on.
I think Councilmember Jawanda might have a disagreement. Yeah, I want to.
That's fine.
Yeah.
I just want to, this is a unique spot in that I'm all for the transit-oriented development, and we want to have more housing there, and I wanted to.
I'm just not sure, just to your point, I'm not sure that there is anything we have adopted here that would bias this towards reducing the amount of parking. So.
Well, that's what I heard from Director Conklin. Maybe, he just said it could be easily be discarded, and because parking certainly is not more desirable than housing as far as the profitability of said product. so
I just think they're seeking to put in additional assurance that parking would not be reduced, and I'm not prepared to make that statement either. I think we just kick that, let that discussion happen at a future time. That would be my recommendation to my colleagues.
Director Conklin, you were trying to say something, and Carrie.
You guys you've all framed the debate properly. There's, the value of the parking spaces here for reducing traffic elsewhere in the county is greater than any of the other metro stations. So that's the reason for our concern.
Right.
And I would just add, through the development process, the zoning ordinance requires us to have parking. So applicants that come in, they'll have to provide parking, unless they receive a waiver or some, but that's
I'm not
atypical.
concerned because it's
Typically
parking.
applicants, if they feel there's demand, they will propose it.
I'm not concerned about the applicant's parking. I'm concerned about the transportation related parking.
Right. I hear you. And I think what I'm saying is that, at metro stations too, we also have shared parking arrangements. And we're tackling this at a number of the metro stations. In fact, a lot of the parking is underutilized at some metro stations, and that's a big issue too. Not this one. Yeah, not this one. But I do think that allowing some flexibility is helpful, because when we get to the development process, if we have a lot of specific language, it can be very challenging for folks that are trying to come into, and for WMATA, frankly. So.
All right. Well, I'm fine. I guess I'm fine with the flexibility. I just want to say, I forget what the data was. This parking lot is always full. It was full a long time ago, and we're not extending the train station at 355. Hopefully, BRT provides some relief, but there's so many more people that are coming from so many other places. It's a pressure. So I just want to go on record that I hope that I'm fine leaving the flexibility. I just hope that's considered when applications come forward, on this.
Everything will always be considered all over again. I can assure you that.
Yeah.
So,
right.
so
Thank
we
you.
3-0, not including that, or 2-1? I just want to make sure.
I'm fine to go 3-0.
All right, 3-0.
And with that, we're done.
All right, we're done. I painfully overestimated the amount of time it was going to take to do this. Without objection, we have a committee recommendation. We have an amended committee recommendation with various, votes along the way.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everyone's great work. And Glenn has said we'll be at full council on Tuesday with this plan. So, we're
That's correct.
try to get this done.
Yep.
And we'll celebrate then. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your work.
Bye.
Okay, now we're going to return to the legislation that we have with appreciation to Council President Hucker, who's been waiting patiently through 2.5 hours of conversation that I said what I thought would be an hour. And I think we'll go into welcome back. Let's do the windows. I think there's not much left there. We can knock that out, and then maybe we can at least get to. We'll see what we can achieve with the mercury regulators. All right. So Christine, welcome back. You prepped us. Let's go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, council members. This is your third work session regarding Bill 5120, which would, as you know, require the installation of window guards in certain rental properties. You covered a number of issues in your prior work sessions. Unless you would like me to revisit any of that or need clarifications, I'll jump into the issue number 1 on page 4 of the staff memorandum for today's work session. Great. So we have the first issue relates to potential amendments that would give greater specificity in the bill to which windows the requirement actually applies to. These are amendments which I believe were suggested by AOBA, and Director Nagam can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that these were acceptable amendments to DHCA. Essentially just specifying that the section doesn't apply to a ground floor or basement, so it adds basement windows, windows containing certain air conditioning units, if the units are properly installed.
Windows you can fall out of, yes.
Right, yes,
Indeed.
so,
okay.
Right, so I think those amendments are fairly clear.
Okay, good. Without objection on those. All right. Great. Thank you, Christine.
Okay, and then item number 2, this is an amendment that was requested by DHCA to tighten up the definition of window guard under the bill so that a window guard would be defined not only as a physical barrier, but it could be a limiting device attached to the window to prevent occupants from falling out. So I think that just broadens slightly, actually broadens the definition so that it's clear that DHC has a little more flexibility in identifying the types of mechanisms that would prevent individuals from falling.
Okay. Seems reasonable to me. Any comments? All good? Okay. Without objection.
Item number 3, this might be an issue in which you want to turn to some of our participants in the work session from DHCA and the fire department, perhaps DPS, related to fire safety. So in discussions about this bill, there were questions about whether DHCA might require certifications, landlords to obtain certifications by third parties to identify which windows should and should not have window guards for purposes of safety. And DHCA had proposed a potential amendment. It's under item 3. It's at the top of page 6 of the staff memorandum. So I don't know if the chair might, want to invite the DHCA director to speak to this, because I'm not sure of what their current request is.
Well, let me start from a baseline here. I personally have some concerns about this idea, so I'm not sure we want to, make it so intensive. So I think this is so simple, for us to kind of overdo it with an inspection like this. I think so. Does a council member want to propose this idea? I guess that's the question I would. Then I'm happy to discuss it, but if not, I think we can keep moving. Okay, let's keep moving.
Item number 4 relates to an amendment proposed by Council President Hucker to require certain outreach and education by DHCA to landlords and tenants of multifamily dwellings about the window guard requirements.
Absolutely. Without objection, right? Yep. Okay.
Chairman Reamer, if I can just interject for a second on the last point, just to make it clear why this was there in the first place. The language that is proposed in point number 3 on page 5, I think in my printout, it was there because DSCA doesn't have the expertise in determining which one is the egress windows. Now, subsequently, we learned from the fire chief's office that they're agnostic about egress window. So if we're going to put window guards on all of the units, then DSCA is not going to require any certification.
Council President informs me that MCFRS thinks we're good as is.
AC Kinchy waited patiently through the last work session on this, and we never got to this. And he was on this morning earlier, and I think he might be on now. But in my conversation with Chief Goldstein, they clarified these are not the heavy-duty iron bars intended to keep anybody from getting into a property. These are flimsy little. I know I mentioned this before. Okay, here we go. Here's the operations chief. These things can be kicked aside by a 14-year-old. So their intention is just to keep a 3-year-old from falling out of a window. Chief?
Yeah, hi, I'm John Kinsley. I'm the operations chief working for our Chief Scott Goldstein. Councilmember Hucker, you're absolutely right. Our concern would be that if these were steel bars like you see in the city that takes a power saw to remove, that would be a problem for the fire department. But what we're talking about is not that extensive. My main concern for my firefighters is that we're able to get a window open in order to rescue a trapped occupant, move a hand line in to put water on the fire, or to let hot gas and smoke escape. And on the other side, the occupant needs to be able to self-evacuate if there were a fire. And the type of window guards that we're talking about, held on by 4 screws or by pressure, very easily removed by the occupant or firefighter. So we're satisfied that we're on the right track here.
I mean, they open too, right? It
depends on the model. Yes, sir.
By the one open too. Yep.
Thank you. It's good to know. I mean, that's a crucial consideration here. Firefighters need to get in. People need to be able to get out.
Yeah, and I'll just comment. I've personally been on several of these instances where the children have fallen from the windows, and it's a tragedy. And I appreciate your efforts to pass this legislation.
Thank you. Good feedback. All right, so back where we were.
Item number 5, which is your last item for this bill, relates to whether landlords may charge tenants for window guard installation and maintenance. The bill as written does not permit landlords to do so. AOBA has requested an amendment, which you can see at the top of page 8 of the staff memorandum, that would allow landlords to charge tenants for the installation or maintenance of a window guard under this section. And just by way of comparison, I would note for you that in New York City, landlords are permitted to charge a one-time fee for the installation, not for the maintenance of window guards. And at least for purposes of their rent control, there is a limit of $10 per window for the charge, just to give you a little bit more of a context.
All right. Personally, I'm not seeing it. Any comments here from colleagues? All right. I mean, I think this is I
don't think they should have. I don't think the tenant should have to pay. It's required by law. I don't think the tenant should have to pay for it.
It's for safety, right? So if it's
if the tenant breaks it, now that's a different issue. They should pay to replace it, but to have it installed originally, no.
And is there any reason why if a tenant broke one that the landlord would not be able to charge them for replacement?
They can charge for that.
Right. Council President Hucker.
I agree with you. I would only point out this is in the landlord's interest as well. No one is going to be lining up to rent apartments in unsafe properties, and this certainly protects the landlord as well as the tenant for a very small cost.
Yeah. Can we just clarify how much do the window guards retail for?
$25.35.
This is a small cost.
They're on Amazon, Home Depot.
Honestly, I mean, I think some of this is a bit of a distinction without a difference because ultimately it'll get passed through. But yeah, I think the message is
that's right.
I mean, it'll just be spread out among everybody as opposed to one particular tenant, more or less. So, I don't feel strongly one way or the other.
And I certainly wouldn't want to have anyone feel like they had a disincentive to get a guard or something. Mm-hmm. All right. So, is that everything, Christine?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So now you're at the point of whether you would like to recommend the bill with the amendments that you previously approved.
Super. Well, I'll with Operations Chief Kinsley's pointed comment about having to attend or be on a call for these kinds of tragedies, I think that's appropriate for us to have that in mind. Any comments from the Council President as we vote on this bill now?
I didn't prepare any, Mr. Chair, but thank you for your hard work on this, and thanks everybody at DHCA and Chief Kinsley and everybody else. I mean, we pass a lot of legislation, and sometimes you don't really, especially when it's a master plan, you don't always see, where this is headed and what's going to happen 20 years from now, and some you don't know who it's really going to affect. This is a bill that's going to keep a lot of people safer right away as soon as it's implemented. So it's very practical, it's very understandable and simple, and I appreciate your attention to it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great. All right. We have a committee recommendation. All in favor, show of hands. All right. Unanimous. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move to the next item, and a not unrelated, new approach to dealing with fire safety. And Christine, let's get into it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So moving on to your item 3, Bill 50-20 related to the replacement of mercury service regulators in certain rental properties. As you know, this is your second work session related to this bill. There are a few items notified in the staff memorandum for potential amendments, but I'm wondering if the chair would like to start with any comments from our partners at Washington Gas, or to get some more context, because I know that one of the some of the issues during the first work session were that we're in search of more information, I think, about Washington Gas's PSC approved plan to replace the regulators throughout the state, and also related to a current process that's available on the Washington Gas website by which a customer can take a photograph of their regular, send it in to Washington Gas, and to see if it contains mercury, and then to work on getting it replaced. So I mean, obviously defer to the chair. I can jump into the issues if you'd like, but I know that council members have wanted more information on those pieces.
Yeah, let's go to the tough issue or the unresolved issue, because I think if we could decide where we are on that, then it might just be we can resolve the rest of the bill quickly. So I'm not winging it here, but I'm going based on what my staff has, and I'll turn to the council president in a moment. What my staff has said is that there's sort of an unclear question at this point as to what will Washington Gas do with the information that the bill would have landlords sent, property owners sent. So I'd like to hear what Washington Gas is going to do with that information. And I'll just say, my general inclination is to say it can only help. And so I don't know why we wouldn't proceed. But welcome. Well, actually, Tom, did you want to make any comment? And then we'll go to hear from Washington Gas.
I'm here to talk.
Sorry, switching windows here. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there's been, this bill was introduced quite a while ago. The tragedy it's intended to prevent from happening again happened even longer ago, and it's been a while since the last work session. So, just for anybody tuning in for the first time or who hasn't followed all the twists and turns of this saga, let me just say at the beginning, we're here because of many years of negligence by Washington Gas resulted in the deaths of 7 of our constituents. If the fatal explosion in August 2016 at Flower Branch. It also caused the injuries of dozens more of our constituents and the displacement of hundreds of them. We didn't know on the night, so many of us were there, on the night of the explosion, what was the cause, and now we do. And we were shocked to find out from a federal agency that not only did Washington Gas fail to meet the requirements of a previous order by the PSC, but they collected millions of dollars from ratepayers to do the work of removing and replacing these dangerous, faulty mercury regulators, and they never did the work. They kept the money, they never rebated it back to taxpayers, they never did the work. And our constituents, some of them paid the price with their lives, unfortunately. So the language in this bill came about after the NTSB had been working on their investigation. And it came about after meetings that I had with the new leadership of Washington Gas after their merger with AltaGas. And their new management told us and the public, told me and my staff, but also told the tenants at Flower Branch, and they told them this in the presence of the PSC staff, that they had already replaced regulators at properties owned by K Management and other landlords who had come forward and volunteered the location of the regulators. But they pointed out they don't have regulatory authority over landlords like we do. And they needed our help to push landlords to report the locations of these dangerous regulators, now that we know there are hundreds more locations in the metro area. And that if we could work together to just push landlords to report these locations, Washington Gas would expeditiously replace those to remove this dangerous, possibly fatal hazard from the apartments where we have residents sleeping tonight and last night and tomorrow night. And so we drafted the bill to do exactly that. Then they've changed some of their leadership and they've changed their position on this, and they got a favorable ruling from the PSC that gives them a very long timeline to remove and replace these regulators. But that doesn't remove our responsibility. We don't regulate Washington Gas, the state does. We do regulate landlords. And it's still very important for us to do everything we know that we're able to do to make sure that we have reported to Washington Gas the location of the regulators in Montgomery County, so that Washington Gas can then fulfill their responsibility to expeditiously replace them. We cannot force them to do that. Really, only the PSC can do that. But we need to do our part to make sure they have that information and not allow landlords to sit on that information and leave our tenants at risk every night. That's the core of this bill here. And that's why we need to do everything we can to keep our tenants safe while we can't control Washington Gas, and to remove, honestly, our liability in the case, God forbid, of another future fatal explosion. We need to do everything we can. Landlords need to do what they can do, and Washington Gas needs to replace these expeditiously. They're years overdue. Their negligence created this fatal explosion in the first place. We cannot let that happen again, and that's why we drafted this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your responsiveness to the underlying condition and the problem that has resulted. So why don't we invite our WSSC to share any comments here? And again, actually, I'll turn it to Christine. So the issue that I was honing in on here, this question of should property owners be required to send the photos. Can you just characterize that for us, and then I'll ask for comment from Washington Gas as to what their view is of the benefit of that.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So the issue, as you said, was that at the prior work session, you had recommended a potential amendment through which landlords would not on their own determine whether there's a mercury service regulator present, because obviously they don't have that expertise and they're not responsible for doing the replacement. So, but to rather require landlords to send a photograph to Washington Gas, taking advantage of a process that Washington Gas currently has on its website, through which any customer can take a photograph of their service regulator, mail it to Washington Gas, and then someone from Washington Gas can tell you whether it is indeed a mercury service regulator, and can then carry out the replacement. So, and then the issue is that during discussions with Washington Gas, staff try to get some clarity on, going forward, if this bill is enacted, what will Washington Gas be continuing this service that it provides on its website, so that our landlords can utilize that. So we just don't, really have a clear answer on that. I did include in the staff packet a written response, which we did receive, which stated from Washington Gas, we voluntarily posted this information on our website. There's no approved program. And then they stated, so should this legislation be enacted, we would add information explaining that Montgomery County customers will not be prioritized outside of our approved MSR replacement program. So I think that's the area where we probably could benefit from more information from the Washington Gas representatives.
All right, let's hear from them.
Thanks, Councilmember Brian Smith here with Washington Gas. First and foremost, safety is our number one priority as a company, safely and reliably delivering energy to customers in Montgomery County, as well as our other service area in Maryland, the District of Columbia, and Virginia. So I would just start by saying that. We've been working closely since this bill's introduction with Council President's staff, as well as other staff throughout the council, in trying to provide information. And Council President Hucker did mention that he had conversations with previous leadership, and that's the inflection point, right? So we've sent a one-pager to this committee explaining sort of the timeline of what's going on. And those conversations were before December 18th, when the PSC approved an option for this replacement program in case number 9622. And as a result of 9622, we now have an approved plan from the commission that the NTSB recommended for us to go out, conduct a survey to locate this equipment, and then begin replacement of the equipment within 3 years for multifamily, 5 years for all other properties throughout our service area. So to provide a bit more clarity or color, John Dodge is here from our regulatory affairs team, and I will pass it to Mr. Dodge.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Council President Hucker, members of the council. My name is John Dodge. I'm Associate General Counsel of the company and Director of Regulatory Matters. This is my first time appearing before the council, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. You may hear my dog in the background in a minute as the mailman makes his way up my street, and I apologize in advance for that. With all due respect to Council Members Hucker's comments, which I know are born of sincere concern, I'd like to correct the record before I answer the question pending. First, there has been no finding in any court, in any federal agency, and not at the Public Service Commission, that Washington Gas was negligent in its handling of mercury service regulators. None. That's just not true. Second, we did not collect millions of dollars of ratepayer money for work that was not performed. We collected the actual cost of replacing mercury service regulators since 2004. So there hasn't been a surplus collection from ratepayers. Finally, as Brian just indicated, the plan that was approved in December of 2020 by the Maryland Public Service Commission was also approved by the National Transportation Safety Board. That agency, as we know, found that the probable cause of the terrible accident and tragedy was a failure of a mercury service regulator. The NTSB's findings was not allowed in case number 9622 as it constitutes hearsay. So with those corrections, now I'd like to proceed, if I may, to answer the question as best I can about what we will do with the information collected from our website or otherwise collected from Montgomery County landlords. The short answer is that we will fold it into our approved plan, and as Brian said, we will not redline another county or another section of the state in favor of Montgomery County. We have a plan to survey all locations within 1 year, and even if we receive information from a landlord or another source, our survey crews will still go to that location to confirm a mercury service regulator, So this is belt and suspenders for us. We welcome the option to have information sent to us. We'll fold it into our approved plan, and working with our contract crews, we'll remove those regulators as expeditiously and safely as we can. And I'm happy to answer any other questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll see if my colleagues have any questions on this particular component of the legislation. Okay, so you'll fold it into your review. I saw a hand go up, but then I lost somebody, so I don't know what happened there. Okay, Kevin Carey.
Hi, Kevin Carey with AOBA. The one, I mean, obviously we all have the same concern of safety. K Apartments is actually a long-time member of AOBA, and it's we do want to do our part or have our members do their part. The concern would be in the expectation of landlords and tenants if they make, if our landlord takes a picture, says it's Washington Gas, or their expectation might be that this will suddenly get replaced within a shorter time frame or just get bumped to the top of the line. But you know how expectations could be. Whereas it sounds like, I mean, obviously it's going to be part of the plan, but it's not like, Washington Gas is going to take a crew and dedicate them only to phone-ins or receiving these photographs. So in that respect, we're happy to have our landlords provide access at any time. We'll communicate with all of our property managers, but we're just concerned about the expectation from them of when this work would get done. And it sounds like Washington Gas clearly has a plan, 1 year plan for the survey, a 3-year plan for the replacement of these. So just expectation is what we're concerned for our members and our tenants.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know.
I have a question.
Oh, Rosie, and then I see Miss Francis also.
The Public Service Commission and Washington Gas have worked out a plan to make these repairs. I'm trying to understand what role DHCA has in getting this done.
Well, at the moment, we're talking about a specific part of the bill. which, and I'll ask staff to make sure I'm characterizing this accurately, but we're talking about a specific part of the bill that requires property owners to take a photo of what regulator they have and send it to Washington Gas, which is a procedure that Washington Gas had on their website previously, inviting property owners to provide them that information. And so the legislation would basically mandate that. And DHCA then, I suppose, would have the requirement to implement that mandate and make sure that property owners are aware and that they fulfill that requirement. Pretty simple, I think, actually. Okay.
The way we understand this, so when the mercury service regulator is replaced, then DHCA will come to know and then will keep a searchable database by public. So that's, and then besides the education component.
Well, you may be getting into other pieces of the legislation. I was really only trying to address this one component. Ms. Francis, on this one piece, please. Otherwise, we'll go back. Well, I'll ask Ms. Wellens to start back from the bill, and we'll move through.
Thank you very much. I'm Fran Francis, General Counsel of AOBA. I welcome this opportunity. I believe while this bill, well-intentioned, could cause much confusion with property owners, and my other concern is that it will shift the burden of proof of requiring landlords to identify something that they really have no knowledge of other than a picture, and cause them to go looking for something and perhaps miss a mercury regulator, not get all of them, and therefore shift the burden of proof that they missed something and they are liable for any potential problem. I think when this bill came about, it was prior to the Public Service Commission order, and now we have a plan. If this will not change the expectations of Washington Gas in what order they will change out the mercury regulators, I think if a landlord sends in a photo, his expectation will be that it will happen almost immediately. And that even if the landlord is able to identify a mercury regulator, there may be more than one on a property. If there are many apartment units, suppose they miss one. Washington Gas could potentially be misled into thinking they changed out all of the mercury regulators when in fact they haven't. This is not an area where our members have any expertise. We think it's an unnecessary legislation.
All right, appreciate that. I just want to say, I think we came more than halfway towards you. The original draft of the bill said you would be required to send a photo of a mercury regulator if you found one. And we adjusted that to just say, you'll send a photo of whatever you have. That way you're under no obligation to accurately identify what it is. And I was very sympathetic to your situation there, seemingly being required to identify something that maybe you wouldn't identify correctly. I think now you're describing a very narrow, problem area. What if we didn't know where all the regulators were? I find that a little, it doesn't seem like a huge concern to me, but Mr. Hucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is funny to hear some of this response. I think if we had a more reflective panel here, if we were going to debate this again, we have folks here who, of course, didn't show up to testify for or against the bill when there was a hearing. And I think if we had representatives of our affected tenants here or our official representatives like the Renters Alliance or partners like CASA, they would have a very different point of view from what you're being told. I didn't say Washington Gas was found negligent in a court. I'm saying they're negligent. And I've been to the funerals of these tenants whose families would tell you the same thing, and the NTSB report indicates the same thing. The fact that you don't have that is because Washington Gas settled out of court for many millions of dollars with the affected tenants. And as far as Ms. Francis concerns, it is kind of shocking after at least 3 meetings we've had with AOBA and our willingness to take many of AOBA's amendments that they're here with any concerns, because ultimately this bill protects their property. And it protects the tenants and the staff of AOBA of landlords who often live in those properties, so that they don't. AOBA should have written this bill years ago, because especially once we found out that there are hundreds of these dangerous regulators in properties, in our multifamily properties in Montgomery County and in the Washington Gas Service area, AOBA should have been leading the charge to remove them out of just their financial self-interest, much less their interest in reducing their own liability. But they haven't, and they're still here trying to water down the bill, which is just, it's very unseemly and I think reprehensible. That the bill is necessary, despite what Ms. Francis is telling. It's quite different than what we were told in meetings with AOBA about this. And we have to do what's in the interest of protecting our tenants and protecting Montgomery County government, which now, unlike in previous years, knows that these exist, know that there's hundreds of them that our tenants are sleeping over every night. And we need to meet our responsibility to get them removed. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Chawanda.
Yeah, thank you. Just want to say that I think we've already made accommodation in the last session for this, and trying to just say, I would think you would want more information. I'm glad to hear Mr. Dodge say that there's going to be inspections regardless of what happens. Great. You know, that's good. I think that the more the better. But I don't know why we would not want to create an affirmative way to say, take a picture of what you think it is. There's no, we want to have the most information inputs coming in as possible so the situation can be rectified, so that more people don't die from this situation like happened in Long Branch. I've said this many times before. I grew up across the street from these apartments, and it was a horrible thing, and we want to go above and beyond here. Again, we can tackle the liability question, later, but this is about, let's get as much as we can inputs into the system so you can identify these as quickly as possible and get and replace them. So I think we should just do what we did last time and just move on from this issue would be my recommendation.
But sorry, there is no liability for the landlord since that was raised in the bill.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. I had previously said 4:30 hard stop. We are so backed up. If we don't finish, we're not going to finish this bill, I think, but we haven't been able to get to the appropriation. That was item number 4. As far as we can get through this today means that we will be able to get to everything else sooner. So let's keep going until 4:50, and then we'll have to call it. Ms. Francis.
One last statement. Yes, we did participate in all of the work sessions. We thought we had agreed to something. The language that Ms. Nicola Whiteman submitted said a landlord must use best efforts to photograph any meter that could be an indoor mercury services regulator. The language has changed since then. And the way the language is written now, we see it as a step backward. Take a photograph of any indoor gas service mercury regulator. That means to me, it shifts the burden of proof and we have the obligation. If it was written with the amendment that Ms. Whiteman sent out earlier, it would say a landlord must use best efforts. We don't have a problem with that language. So yes, we did compromise on this bill.
Okay, well, Ms. Wellens, can you comment on that distinction?
Yes, I would like to comment because the current language being proposed does say that a landlord must make commercially reasonable efforts to : and then take a photograph, etc. So, and also I would just add for point of clarification that Ms. Whiteman's language, Ms. Whiteman, acknowledged herself that it was not agreed upon language; it was proposed language. I also, just because I forgot to mention earlier and was remiss in not stating that we do also have a representative from the county attorney's office, Ms. Lisa Brennan, on the line, who is really our in-house expert on the PSC order and these related matters. Thank you.
2 things I wanted to bring up. One is, before we close this out, does having the best effort weaken the effectiveness, I mean, that doesn't seem like something that weakens the effectiveness of what we're trying to do here. I don't frankly perceive a difference there. The language that you had drafted, Christine, is my understanding that we said, take a picture of your regulator and send it in.
It's in item 1, and sorry to interrupt, but on page 4 of the staff memorandum under item 1 is the language that staff drafted to try to capture what was discussed during the prior work session. And what I added was, make commercially reasonable efforts to do these things because, as AOBA had mentioned, a landlord might make the reasonable efforts to try to take a photograph, but they might miss a regulator, they might take a photograph of something that's not even a regulator, for example.
Right. And I think this was my recommendation. So
yes.
Where is that draft language then, again, you said?
It's on page 4 of the staff memorandum under item number 1, which is labeled landlord responsibilities.
Item number 1. All right. Take a photograph. Okay. So I'm hearing from AOBA that if they could make best efforts, that would feel different to them. Christine, is there a legal reason that would weaken the bill? I mean, does that weaken anything from your perspective?
I mean, I'm not sure. So I have made commercially reasonable efforts. If they want to change it to best efforts.
Where is the commercially reasonable?
It's under subsection C.
So what is the difference?
Double lined. So yeah, that's more of a question for AOBA. I think if they.
What's the difference? What is the difference between best efforts and commercially reasonable?
Well, commercially reasonable efforts to us implies that AOBA would have some knowledge of these mercury regulators, would have some expertise in them as property owners when they don't. This is totally new for them to go out and try to identify something. So we do hear a legal distinction, and we are concerned about it. And I know Ms. Whiteman had proposed that language. She had sent it to me. I'm sure she could send it to you again. We do see a difference. Commercially reasonable efforts implies that we have some knowledge of how these work, of where they are, of what they look like. This is not our equipment. We don't own it. We didn't install it. It's just on our properties that we give a right to the gas company to install it.
Okay.
So
let's good. Okay. Councilor Friesen, yeah.
Yeah, I think this feels like we're like creating conflict that isn't necessary here, I think on all sides. Could we just eliminate commercially? Because I understand the concern that it's not their commercial area to deal with mercury regulators. That's really Washington Gas. There's a little bit of an awkwardness here that we're asking for the help of the property owner to identify something that really isn't in their expertise, isn't their property, isn't their responsibility, but we're asking for help, which serves everybody's interests. Can we just do reasonable efforts, eliminate commercial?
Yeah.
To me, that would address the issue. I don't know what best means from a legal standpoint, but reasonable efforts is the reasonableness is a common legal standard. Would that help to address some of the issues here? Ms. Francis, with that, if commercial, because it seems like your concern is the commercial aspect of it's implying a level of competence and expertise in an area that is well beyond the purview of a property owner.
I think that's significantly better. I would like not to make a final decision because this is something that Nicola Whiteman has been working on for so long, and we're just filling in for her. So could we have her get back to you? I'm sure she can do so tomorrow.
Well, I'm happy to move if there are real concerns with it. Sorry, Councilmember Joanna. I'm just where I am. I would move that we just eliminate the commercial. I think that addresses the concern from my perspective. Go with reasonable efforts. I think that addresses the issue. If this creates a catastrophic concern and you reach out to us after, we could, take that under advisement as it goes to full council, but I don't think it needs to hold up the moving forward on that. I yield to the sponsor and to colleagues. That's where I'm at. Thank you.
That's what you want.
I just saying I agree. Reasonable efforts is fine. I think it says that already. Reasonable efforts I think will be interpreted fine by any court as reasonable efforts.
Sounds like great. Got agreement, and we'll proceed with that, and we'll hear later from AOBA about it.
I think Councilmember Hucker's Council President's trying
Yes,
to say.
Council President.
I don't have a problem with it. Just to be thorough, because that's not. I don't think our office requested the adjective. I just wanted to ask Christine, what is the distinction that you had in mind between commercially reasonable and reasonable efforts?
Well, to be frank, I think that AOBA had used commercially reasonable in some of the language that it had proposed, but I have no problem. I'm not arguing the point of Nicola Whiteman's specific language on this point. But that's where I had gotten the term commercially reasonable. I think that taking out commercially is a good solution.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so Christine, take us to, okay, there was another issue. I wanted to raise an issue. We were informed by Dan McHugh that buildings built after 1970, I think was the year, no longer had mercury regulators. They were ended. Is that right, Dan?
It's my understanding, and Washington Gas can talk better to this, but after 1970 or 72 is where the cutoff was, where the law changed to remove the mercury regulators from installation.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that the year is about right. I can't say for certain that some weren't deployed after 1970 or 72, but the great bulk were installed from the 1930s through the late 1960s. And in fact, I should have led off my comments by saying our survey takes the approach of looking at the age of the housing stock in our service territory, and we're focusing on the older housing stock first in our survey. We're going to hit every place, but we're looking at the older housing stock first because we have what we call in our PSC case a higher confidence that is where we'll find the MSRs to begin with.
I am looking to not have this apply to buildings where we have a very, 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 very high confidence that there's no mercury regulator there in the first place. So what would be the year where after which there really is, very little, very, very, very little concern that there would be a mercury regulator?
If the choice is between 1970 and 72, I would advise the council to go with 72.
75 better then? I mean, when you said great bulk, I said, oh, never mind, because great bulk could mean 30% of the, they were still, 30% of new buildings still had them.
No, I mean, the vast majority were applied decades earlier than the 1970s. So
1975, I mean, I don't want to,
I don't have a specific year. I can't point you to that, but as with the prior amendment, perhaps we could have a placeholder of 1975, and if we have determinative information for the council, we can present that to the full council.
Okay. I mean,
we also
don't remind myself this is a minimal issue. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry. We also don't want to have a situation where you're picking years where virtually no buildings have them, and you are creating the level of confusion because you're in search of something that doesn't exist. Right. So, I don't think this is a situation where you should take what you think the year is and then pick 3 years above it. I think you should pick where, if 98, 99%, I mean, this is supposed to be helping to get us to where we want to go. Ultimately, it's not the property owner's responsibility. It's Washington Gas's responsibility. The intention here is to provide some help to make this happen, sooner rather than later because it's a life and death issue. So I just would advise that as we figure this out, we not hold out, dozens and dozens and dozens of properties that are almost assuredly likely to have zero of these. That we pick the year that gets us to the overwhelming preponderance of the issue, and we solve almost all of the problem without creating additional problems, which I don't think was ever the intention.
That's what I'm trying to get at. So I think that, why don't we just say 1975 as a placeholder? If Washington Gas can tell us how many mercury regulators there might be installed after that, the reason being, if DHCA can immediately not worry about 20% of the building stock as they try to implement this, it would be smoother for them. And of course, there's no point in making a building owner take a picture, of their regulator if there's zero possibility that it's a mercury regulator.
We will report back, Mr. Chairman, as quickly as we can. And again, we're going to look at every building.
Okay. Well, right. Understood. Okay, Christine, back to where we are. It's 4:50. Okay. So, I think we got through one of the tougher issues. Maybe it'll be smoother sailing for the rest of the bill. And I'll confer with staff, and we'll try to get this back on the calendar at the earliest opportunity. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.